Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I got home late that night after a long day at work. My shift had run over, and I was tired, just wanting to get inside and relax. I parked in my driveway, and as I walked up to my front door, I noticed it was slightly open. Not fully, just enough to see the dark crack. I thought maybe I'd forgotten to lock it in the morning, which was odd because I never do that. But it was late, and my mind was fuzzy, so I brushed it off and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was how cold it was. It felt like no one had been inside for hours. I reached for the light switch, flicked it, but nothing happened. That was strange because I knew I hadn't turned any lights off at the breaker. The whole house was dark, only the faint glow from the street lights outside creeping in through the blinds. I thought maybe a bulb had blown, so I pulled out my phone and used its flashlight to see. As I walked in, I saw my shoes weren't by the door where I usually leave them. I always put them in the exact same spot, but tonight they were scattered, one near the stairs and the other by the wall. I bent down to pick them up, feeling a weird sense that something was off, but I kept trying to convince myself that maybe I had kicked them in a hurry when I left that morning. I moved further into the living room, and that's when I noticed the blanket on the couch was missing. I always left it there, folded neatly. My heart started to race. It wasn't just the blanket, some of the pillows were on the floor, and the TV remote was lying on the coffee table, which I never did. I started to feel uneasy, like I was missing something obvious. I thought about leaving, but it still felt like my house, just wrong in low ways. Maybe I was overreacting. I made my way to the kitchen to check the back door, thinking maybe someone had come in that way. The back door was shut, but the lock looked different, turned the other way. My hands were shaking as I twisted the knob to make sure it was secure. That's when I noticed a faint sound of breathing, very soft, like someone trying to stay quiet. It was coming from the hallway behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. I turned around slowly, shining my phone's light down the hallway. I couldn't see anything at first, just darkness and shadows, but the sound of breathing was getting closer, like it was right behind me. I stepped back, my foot catching on something soft, and I nearly tripped. It was the missing blanket, crumpled on the floor by the kitchen island. I held my breath, straining to listen, trying to figure out what was happening. I thought about calling out, but something told me to stay quiet. I took another step back, inching toward the front door, and that's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, coming from upstairs, moving toward the staircase. I hadn't even checked upstairs yet. I had just assumed no one was there. I panicked, feeling trapped. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were stuck in place. I backed up against the wall, trying to hide in the shadows of the kitchen. I could see the top of the stairs now, just the edge of it, and the light from my phone was bouncing off the walls. That's when I saw a figure, just the outline of a person, moving down the steps slowly, like they were searching for something. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just someone breaking in. This was planned. They were comfortable, moving quietly like they had done this before. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, turning toward the living room. I could see him now, a man, tall, wearing dark clothes. He hadn't seen me yet, but he was scanning the room carefully, taking his time. I knew I had to get out, but I couldn't make a noise. I slipped back toward the front door, every step feeling like an eternity. My hand was shaking so badly, and when I reached the door, I noticed the deadbolt had been turned to lock. I had locked myself in without even realizing it. I fumbled with the lock, trying not to make a sound. Then, a second figure appeared from the hallway, another man, dressed in the same dark clothes. He was whispering something to the first man, pointing toward the kitchen. They were looking for something, or maybe someone. I didn't wait to find out. I finally got the door unlocked and pulled it open just enough to slip outside. I ran to my car, nearly dropping my phone in the process. I jumped in and locked the doors, my hands fumbling to get the keys in the ignition. The car roared to life, and I backed out of the driveway without looking back. I sped down the street, not even caring where I was going. I just needed to get away. It wasn't until I was a few blocks away that I realized I had been in the wrong house. The layout was almost identical to mine, same door, same stairs, same kitchen island, but the little things, the things that were off, made sense now. I had just walked into a stranger's home. The house I'd gone into was empty, a house that criminals were using for whatever they were planning. I pulled over a few streets away, my head spinning. I kept thinking about the figures I had seen, how they moved, how they seemed to be waiting for something. I couldn't believe I had been so careless. I stayed in my car for what felt like hours, shaking and trying to piece together what had just happened. I didn't call the police. I just drove around, trying to calm down. When I finally got back to my actual house, everything was exactly as I had left it. My front door was locked, my lights were on, and nothing was out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling of those figures in the dark, the whispers, the slow footsteps. I still don't know what they were doing in that house, but I'm just glad I got out before they found me. I was driving my rig late at night, hauling a load of pipes across Texas. It was one of those long stretches of highway where the road just seems to go on forever, and you barely see another soul. I was tired, needed a break, so I pulled over at this rest stop, just a small one, nothing fancy. It was past midnight, and the lot was nearly empty, just one other car parked far off in the corner, but the lights inside the building were still on. I got out to stretch my legs, and that's when I saw her. She was standing by the vending machines, this young woman, maybe in her early 20s. She looked rough, like she'd been crying, her clothes a bit dirty, hair all messy. She noticed me and waved, a little hesitant. I wasn't sure what to think at first, but then she walked over, and I could see she was scared, really scared. She asked if I was heading to the next town, said she needed a ride, that her car broke down and she'd been stuck there for hours. I looked around, and there wasn't any broken down car that I could see, but I thought maybe she parked it somewhere out of sight. She didn't look like trouble, just scared and desperate, and I figured the least I could do was help her out. I told her to hop in, and she thanked me, saying she'd just been having a really bad night. She climbed into the passenger side of my cab, and I started the engine, pulling back onto the highway. At first, she was quiet, staring out the window, hands fidgeting with her phone like she was waiting for something. I tried to make small talk, asked her where she was heading, but she kept dodging the questions, giving vague answers like just away and somewhere safe. She mentioned she'd had a fight with her boyfriend and needed to get out, but the way she said it didn't feel right. She was too jumpy, looking over her shoulder every few minutes, like she expected someone to pop out from the back seat. We were about 10 miles down the road when she suddenly grabbed my arm, hard. "You need to go faster," she said, her voice low and urgent. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I noticed headlights in the distance, coming up on us quick. At first, I thought it was just another car passing through, but the way she reacted, it was clear this wasn't random. She kept looking back, breathing fast, muttering under her breath. I sped up a little, but the car behind us did too, staying right on her tail. It was an old, beat-up sedan, dark windows, no plates that I could see. It got closer, riding my bumper, flashing its high beams. The woman started to panic, telling me not to slow down, not to let them get too close. I asked her who it was, what was going on, but she wouldn't answer. She just kept saying, "Don't stop. Don't stop." The car behind us swerved, pulling up alongside the truck like it was trying to force me off the road. I could see a man in the driver's seat, his face shadowed, but he was staring straight at us, like he was sizing us up. I hit the gas, trying to keep ahead, but this guy wasn't letting up. He kept swerving back and forth, edging closer to the truck, making me grip the wheel tight to keep control. The woman was freaking out now, yelling at me to keep going, that if they caught us, it'd be over. She was almost in tears, but there was something off about the way she was acting. She wasn't scared like someone running from a bad breakup. This was different, more desperate, more dangerous. I asked her again who was in the car, why they were after her, but she just kept shaking her head, refusing to say anything. The sedan suddenly sped up and slammed into the side of my rig, jolting us both hard. I nearly lost control, the truck swerving onto the shoulder before I got it back on the road. The woman screamed, grabbing onto the door like she was ready to jump out. I managed to pull ahead just enough to get some distance, but they were right back on us, relentless. Then she did something I didn't expect. She reached into her bag and pulled out a gun, small and beat up, but real. She pointed it at me, her hand shaking, and told me to keep driving, not to stop for anything. She said if I slowed down, she'd shoot, that it was the only way to get away from them. I couldn't believe it. 1 second she was terrified, and now she was the one holding the gun, her eyes wild and unsteady. I tried to stay calm, my mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. She kept glancing back, the headlights still on us, and I realized then that this wasn't some random chase. She knew them, and they knew her. It was all planned, all part of some twisted setup, and now I was caught in the middle of it. The car behind us rammed into the truck again, harder this time. The cab rattled, and I nearly lost my grip on the wheel. I told her she needed to put the gun down, that I couldn't help her if she didn't let me drive right, but she wouldn't listen. She was frantic, shouting at me to go faster, to get us out of there. I could hear the fear in her voice, but there was something else too, something darker, like she wasn't just running, she was hiding something. We hit a stretch of deserted road, no other cars in sight, just empty highway and darkness. The sedan pulled up beside us again, and I thought for sure they were going to try and run us off for good. But then, instead of hitting us, they backed off, falling behind until there were just a pair of faint lights in the distance. The woman let out a shaky breath, lowering the gun but still holding it tight. She told me to keep going, not to slow down until we hit the next town. I did what she said, no other choice, but my mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. I asked her again who those people were, why they were after her, but she just stared ahead, silent. We finally made it to the next town, pulling into a lit-up gas station. I parked the truck, and she got out, still clutching the gun, looking around like she expected someone to jump out at any moment. She didn't thank me, didn't say anything. She just walked away, disappearing around the side of the building. I stayed in the cab, hands shaking, trying to process what just happened. I never saw her again, and I don't know what kind of trouble she was in, but I'll never forget the look in her eyes, that mix of fear and something else, something that still keeps me up at night. I drove away as soon as I could, putting as much distance between me and that gas station as possible. I kept looking over my shoulder for the rest of the drive, expecting the car to show up again, but it never did. I don't know what she was running from, or if she was running at all. All I know is I got lucky that night, getting out of that mess alive. I booked the cabin because I needed a break, some time away from everything. It was this small place, really isolated, up in the woods in Vermont. The kind of place where you're supposed to find peace or whatever. The listing said it was private, with no neighbors for miles, and that sounded perfect to me. It was late fall, the leaves had mostly fallen, and there was a cold bite in the air. I got there around midday, parked my car, and unloaded my stuff. It was just me for the weekend, and I was looking forward to it. The first day was nice enough. I spent most of it sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, reading a book. It felt good to just be away from everything. The cabin was cozy but old, with creaky floors and big windows that looked out into the woods. I didn't see a single person the whole time, which was exactly what I wanted. As the sun started going down, the temperature dropped fast, and I went inside to make some dinner. It was dark by the time I finished eating, and I put on a movie, trying to relax. That's when I first heard it. A noise outside, like a rustling. I paused the movie and listened, thinking maybe it was a deer or something. But it kept going, kind of slow, like footsteps dragging through the leaves. I got up and looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. The porch light wasn't that bright, and everything else was pitch black. I told myself it was probably just the wind or some animal and went back to the couch. But the noise kept coming back, stopping and starting. It was quiet, just enough to make me uneasy, like someone was out there but didn't want to be noticed. I couldn't shake the feeling, so I double-checked that all the doors were locked. I even put a chair under the door handle, just in case. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing sounds, little creaks and soft thuds, like something brushing against the cabin walls. I tried to ignore it, but every time I started to drift off, there'd be another noise. At one point, I swear I heard a faint tapping on the window, just a soft, deliberate knock. I stayed under the covers, holding my breath, too scared to move. I kept thinking about how isolated the cabin was, how nobody would hear if something went wrong. When morning finally came, I felt stupid for being so scared. I got up, made some coffee, and went outside. The sun was just coming up, and it was cold, my breath misting in the air. I walked around to the side of the cabin and stopped dead. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones, leading right up to the window. They were big, like a man's boots, and they circled the cabin, stopping at each window. My stomach dropped. I followed them around to the back of the cabin, and there was a spot where the leaves were all messed up, like someone had been standing there for a while, watching. I looked around, but there was nobody there, just empty woods. I felt exposed, like I was being watched right then, but I couldn't see anyone. I ran back inside and locked the door, heart pounding. I checked my phone, but I had no signal, and the Wi-Fi at the cabin was spotty at best. The weather forecast had mentioned a storm coming in, and the wind was already picking up. I spent most of the day inside, trying to convince myself that it was just some hiker passing through, but the tracks looked too deliberate, too close. I kept peeking out the windows, expecting to see someone, but it was just the trees, swaying in the wind. As the day went on, the sky turned gray, and it started to rain. The kind of heavy, cold rain that makes everything feel worse. By evening, it was pouring, and the wind was howling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing noises outside, muffled by the storm, but still there. I tried to keep busy, turning on the TV, but the reception was terrible. Every time the wind gusted, the cabin would creak and I'd jump. I kept checking the locks, my nerves fraying more by the hour. Around midnight, the power went out. Just like that, everything went dark. I grabbed my phone, but the battery was low, and without Wi-Fi, it was useless. I lit a couple of candles, the shadows flickering on the walls, and sat there, listening to the storm. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, right outside the front door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps moved around the side of the cabin, past the windows, and then stopped. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call for help, but there was no way. I sat there, barely breathing, clutching a kitchen knife I grabbed earlier just in case. The only light was from the candles, and they made everything look eerie, shadows dancing like something was moving just out of sight. Then there was a loud bang, like someone hitting the side of the cabin. I jumped, nearly dropping the knife. The banging continued, coming from different sides, like whoever was out there was trying to find a way in. I stood up, backing into the corner, trying to keep every window in sight. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them, the shuffling, the occasional tap on the glass. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat there, every noise making me jump. The storm raged outside, and I felt trapped, stuck in the dark with no way to call for help. At some point, the banging stopped, and it got quiet, just the wind and rain. But I knew whoever it was hadn't gone far. I stayed in that corner until the first light of dawn peeked through the windows. When it was light enough to see, I cautiously went to the door and opened it a crack. The footprints were back, deeper this time, circling the cabin. There were marks on the windows, smudges like someone had been pressing their hands against the glass. The rain had washed away most of the tracks, but I could still see where they had been. My car was untouched, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my things, tossed them into the car, and got out of there as fast as I could. The roads were slick, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but the road stayed empty. I didn't stop until I was miles away, at a diner off the main highway. I finally got a signal and checked my messages, but there was nothing, just the usual junk. I never found out who it was or why they were there. I tried calling the rental company later, but they brushed it off, said maybe it was just some local messing around. But I know what I heard, what I saw. Someone was out there, watching me, and I was completely alone. I was driving through Nevada, trying to make it to my friend's place in Utah before dark. It was one of those long stretches of highway where you don't see much of anything, just miles of desert and a few scattered towns that all look the same. My gas tank was half full, and I figured I'd be fine until the next stop. It was hot, the kind of dry heat that makes the road shimmer, and I hadn't seen another car in a while. That's when I spotted him. A guy, standing on the side of the road, his thumb out. I usually never pick up hitchhikers, but he looked harmless enough, mid-30s, wearing a faded backpack and jeans, just a regular guy. I felt bad leaving him out there in the heat, and something about the empty road made me feel sorry for him. So, I pulled over. He got in, thanked me right away, and introduced himself as Rob. He didn't look like a threat, average build, short hair, sunburned face. We made some small talk, and he told me he was trying to get to the next town over. Said his car broke down a couple of days ago, and he'd been stuck, trying to find a ride. I didn't think much of it. People get stranded out here all the time. At first, everything was fine. We talked about the heat, the long stretches of nothingness on the highway. He asked me where I was headed, and I told him I was just passing through, trying to make it to Utah. He nodded, looking out the window. The conversation was casual, and I was glad to have someone to talk to. It made the drive less boring. But then he started asking questions. Not normal questions, though. He asked if I was married, if I had kids, stuff that felt a bit too personal for someone I just met. I told him no, trying to keep my answers short. He kept going, asking if I lived alone, if anyone was expecting me. I started to feel uneasy, but I brushed it off, telling myself he was just making conversation. We drove in silence for a while after that, but I could feel him watching me. I tried to focus on the road, but every time I glanced over, he was looking at me, his eyes dark, almost studying me. He asked if I believed in fate, if I thought people met for a reason. I laughed it off, saying I didn't think much about it, but he kept pressing, like he was fishing for something. By the time we reached the next town, the sun was starting to set. I pulled into a gas station, figuring this was where we part ways. I was relieved to see some signs of civilization, lights, a diner, a few other cars. I told him this was his stop, but he just sat there, staring straight ahead. I repeated myself, telling him this was as far as I could take him, but he didn't move. Instead, he asked if I could drive him a bit further, just past the town to a friend's place he said was only a few more miles. His voice was calm, but there was something off about it, like he was expecting me to agree without question. I told him I was low on gas and needed to get going, but he just kept insisting. He didn't get angry or loud, just persistent, like he wasn't going to take no for an answer. I tried to keep things light, but I was getting nervous. I didn't want to cause a scene, and part of me felt guilty, like maybe I was overreacting. I agreed to take him a little further, figuring I'd drop him off at the next available spot. As soon as we left the gas station, though, I regretted it. The road ahead was empty, the sky getting darker by the minute. He started talking again, but this time it was different. He was asking me about my fears, if I was afraid of anything. I tried to laugh it off, saying I didn't scare easy, but he just kept pushing, asking if I was afraid of being alone, of being trapped. He talked about how easy it was to disappear out here, how nobody would notice if someone just vanished in the desert. My hands were sweating on the wheel. I tried to play it cool, but I was looking for any excuse to pull over and get him out. There was nothing around us anymore, just empty road and desert. I could feel my pulse in my ears, and every time I glanced at him, he was already staring back, his expression flat, like he was waiting for something. After about 15 minutes of driving, he pointed to a small dirt road that veered off the highway and told me to turn there. He said his friend's place was down that way. I slowed down, looking at the narrow path, but I didn't see any signs of a house, no lights, nothing. I told him it didn't look right, that maybe he had the wrong turn. He just kept insisting, his voice calm but firm, like he was trying to hypnotize me into doing what he wanted. I kept driving, pretending like I didn't see the turn. That's when his tone changed. He told me to stop the car, his voice sharper now, almost angry. I told him I couldn't, that I needed to get going, but he reached over and grabbed the wheel, trying to yank it to the right. I swerved, almost losing control, but managed to straighten out. My heart was racing, and I yelled at him to get out, but he just leaned back in his seat, smiling like he knew something I didn't. There was a car behind us now, headlights coming up fast, and I felt a surge of relief, thinking maybe they'd help. But then the car sped up, swerving into our lane, forcing me to slow down. I didn't know what was happening, but it felt like I was being trapped. Rob just kept smiling, not even looking back at the car, like this was all part of some plan. The car behind us honked, the driver flashing their brights, blinding me in the rearview mirror. I pulled over, my mind racing with what to do next. Rob didn't move. He just sat there, waiting. I told him to get out again, but he ignored me, his smile fading into something colder. The car behind us pulled up alongside, and a guy got out, walking up to my window. He was big, rough-looking, and he knocked on the glass, telling me to step out. I looked over at Rob, and he just nodded, like he knew this guy. I realized then that this wasn't random. They were together. My instincts kicked in. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires squealing as I took off, swerving back onto the highway. I didn't care about the car behind us anymore. I just drove, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. Rob was shouting, reaching for the wheel again, but I elbowed him hard, knocking him back. I floored it, the engine roaring, and the car behind us started to fall back. Rob finally stopped trying to fight me. He just sat there, breathing heavy, staring out the window like he'd lost whatever game he was playing. I drove until I saw lights in the distance, another town coming up. I pulled into a crowded diner parking lot, slammed on the brakes, and shouted at him to get out. This time, he did. He didn't say anything, just got out and walked away, disappearing into the shadows between the buildings. I sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to catch my breath. I watched him until he was gone, then locked my doors and drove straight to a motel. I didn't sleep much that night, just kept thinking about how easily things could have gone wrong. I never picked up a hitchhiker again after that. I was house-sitting for my friend Emily at her place in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky. She was on a trip, and since her farmhouse was pretty isolated, she didn't want to leave it empty. It wasn't a bad setup, nice, quiet, lots of open land around. The house itself was old, though, and creaky. Every night it made all sorts of noises, just the way old houses do, I guess. At first, I didn't think much of it. You hear a bump or a thud and figure it's just the wind or the wood settling. The first night there, I noticed the back door rattling a bit. It was one of those old wooden doors with a flimsy lock, and I could feel the draft coming in from outside. I made sure it was locked, double-checked it even, but it kept making this tapping sound like someone was testing it from the outside. I brushed it off, just wind, I told myself, but it kept me up half the night. Next morning, I found a mug in the sink that I was sure I hadn't used. I'm not messy. I hadn't made coffee or anything yet, but there it was, a dirty mug. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe Emily had forgotten to wash it before she left. Little things like that happened, stuff moved around, lights flickering now and then. I'd hear footsteps upstairs when I was downstairs, and when I go up, there was nothing there. Just the house settling, I kept telling myself. A couple of days in, I started feeling like I wasn't alone. You know that feeling, like someone's watching you even when you can't see anyone? I tried to shake it, but it got to the point where I'd locked the bathroom door when I showered, just out of habit. I felt silly, but it made me feel safer. At night, the noises seemed to get louder. I'd hear something that sounded like whispering, but it was so faint, like it was coming from the walls. One night, I woke up to a loud thud from downstairs. I shot up, heart racing, but after a few minutes, it was quiet again. I figured it must have been something falling over, maybe a loose window slamming shut. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to check around, but everything looked normal. I went back to bed, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I found the front door unlocked. I knew I had locked it the night before. I always checked every door before going to bed. But there it was, slightly open, just enough to make me uneasy. I started to think maybe someone was messing with me, but I couldn't figure out why or how. I was in the middle of nowhere, after all. I tried calling Emily, but the signal out there was terrible. The call dropped every time I tried, so I left a message telling her everything was fine, not wanting to freak her out over nothing. But by then, I was starting to feel on edge. I kept a kitchen knife on the nightstand, just in case, and I made sure all the windows were locked tight. That night, I heard a scraping sound coming from the living room. I sat up in bed, listening, trying to figure out if it was inside or outside. The noise stopped, then started again, slow and deliberate, like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the covers, staring at the dark hallway outside my bedroom door. After a while, it stopped, and I convinced myself it was a raccoon or something outside. I finally managed to fall asleep, but I kept waking up every hour or so, listening for more noises. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly, and my blood ran cold. There was a figure standing at the foot of my bed. I froze, unable to scream or move. He was just standing there, a man, tall and thin, wearing dirty clothes and a blank expression. His hair was messy, and his eyes were wide, like he hadn't slept in days. I thought I was dreaming at first, but he spoke, his voice low and rough, demanding to know why I was in his house. I didn't know what to say. I stammered something about being a friend of Emily's, house-sitting while she was away. He just stared at me, like he was trying to figure out if I was lying. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't believe what was happening. He kept saying it was his house, over and over, getting angrier each time. I tried to reach for the knife on the nightstand, but he noticed and stepped closer. I could see the dirt on his hands, the wild look in his eyes. He told me I needed to leave, that I didn't belong there. I was scared out of my mind, but I managed to nod, telling him I'd go, that I didn't want any trouble. He just stood there, watching me, not moving. I kept trying to think of how to get out without setting him off. I told him I'd grab my stuff and leave, and he finally nodded, but he didn't step back. I got out of bed slowly, keeping my eyes on him the whole time, and backed out of the room. I grabbed my phone and car keys from the dresser without turning my back on him. As I moved toward the hallway, he followed, still muttering to himself about how it was his house, his things. I didn't look back, just kept walking, hoping he wouldn't do anything crazy. When I reached the front door, I bolted out, not even bothering to grab my shoes. I ran to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I looked back at the house, and he was standing on the porch, just staring at me, his silhouette dark against the porch light. I didn't waste any time. I backed out of the driveway and drove until I hit the main road, my heart pounding the whole way. I didn't stop until I was in the next town, parked under a streetlight, trying to calm down. I called the police, but by the time they got to the farmhouse, there was no sign of him. They searched the place and said it didn't look like anyone had been living there, but there were signs that someone had been squatting. There were empty food cans in the basement, and the back door had scratch marks near the lock, like someone had been picking at it. They told me it was probably a drifter, someone who'd been using the house while it was empty, maybe someone who'd been watching me the whole time. I don't know how long he'd been there, or how many nights he'd been inside while I was asleep. I just know I'm never going back. I told Emily to get better locks, to put up cameras, but even then, I don't think I'd ever feel safe there again. I still see his face sometimes when I close my eyes, that blank look, like he wasn't all there. I keep wondering how close I was to something worse, how lucky I was to wake up when I did. It's the kind of thing you never think will happen to you until it does, and now I can't stop thinking about what else might have been hiding in that house all along. I was driving home late from a job up in the mountains, taking one of those narrow, winding roads that barely had any guardrails. It was pitch dark, and the only light was from my headlights and the occasional flash of a sign telling me how far the drop was if I screwed up a turn. I was tired, ready to be home, but I was trying to stay focused because one wrong move and it'd be a long way down. The road was empty, not a car in sight, which was fine by me. I just wanted to get home. I didn't notice the car behind me at first. I was coming around a sharp bend, and when I glanced in my rearview mirror, there it was, headlights right on me. It was so close I couldn't even see the front of their car, just the blinding lights filling up my mirror. I figured it was some impatient driver wanting to pass, but there was nowhere to pull over on that stretch, no shoulder, just rock on one side and a drop on the other. I slowed a little, hoping they'd back off, but they didn't. Instead, they got closer, like they were trying to nudge me forward. My heart started to race. I could feel the pressure of their headlights, and every time I glanced in the mirror, it was just light and nothing else. I tapped my brakes slightly, just to signal them to back off, but they didn't. They just stayed on my bumper, pushing me faster than I was comfortable going on that road. I tried to keep calm, telling myself it was just some jerk with no patience, but then they started flashing their high beams, on and off, blinding me. I was gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt, and my mind was racing. Why were they doing this? I didn't know if they were trying to make me pull over or what, but I couldn't stop there. There was nowhere safe. I took a chance and sped up, hoping to put some distance between us, but they kept up. Every turn I took, they took. Every time I sped up, they matched me. I was starting to panic. I didn't know these roads well, and I wasn't sure where the next pull-off was. I just wanted them to go away, to leave me alone, but they were glued to me, like they were waiting for me to make a mistake. After what felt like forever, I spotted a side road up ahead, barely visible in the dark. It looked rough, more like a dirt path than an actual road, but I didn't care. I just needed to get off that main road and away from this car. I took the turn fast, too fast, and I felt my tires slip on the gravel before I managed to straighten out. For a second, I thought maybe I'd lost them, but then I saw their headlights swinging in behind me, kicking up dust as they followed. The side road was worse than I thought, just dirt and rocks and way too narrow. It twisted through trees, and the whole time, that car stayed right behind me, never slowing, never backing off. I could barely see where I was going with all the dust in my headlights, but I kept driving, hoping I'd find a way out or maybe a house or something. Anything. But then I saw it, a dead end. The road just stopped, blocked by a thick line of trees and some old fence posts. I slammed on the brakes, nearly skidding into the trees. I was trapped. I looked back, and the car had stopped a little ways behind me, its headlights still glaring. My mind was racing. I didn't know what to do. I thought about backing up, but there was no room to turn around, and they were blocking the way out. The car's engine went quiet, and then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, tall and broad, wearing dark clothes. He didn't say anything, didn't call out. He just started walking toward me, slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world. I locked my doors, fumbling with the button, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept thinking, who's this guy? What does he want? He didn't look like he was there to help, that's for sure. He got closer, and I could see his face in the glow of my headlights, blank, expressionless, like this was just another day for him. He reached my window and tried the handle. When it didn't open, he knocked on the glass, not hard, just this slow, deliberate tap. I could hear his knuckles against the window, even with my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't roll down the window. I just stared straight ahead, hoping he'd go away, but he didn't. He knocked again, then leaned down, looking right at me. He mouthed something, but I couldn't hear it. I shook my head, trying to tell him to back off, but he didn't move. I couldn't see his hands. I didn't know if he had a weapon, but the way he was just standing there, so calm, scared me more than anything. I glanced around the car, looking for anything I could use. My phone had no signal, and there wasn't much else. I thought about trying to ram my way past him, but there wasn't enough room to get around his car without getting stuck. My mind was spinning, and I felt trapped, like there was no way out. He walked around to the back of my car, and for a second, I lost sight of him in the rearview mirror. My breath caught, and I didn't know what he was doing, but then I heard something, a metallic scraping sound. I turned around, and I saw him messing with something near my back tire. I didn't wait to find out what. I slammed the car into reverse, flooring it without thinking. The car jerked back, clipping the edge of his bumper. He jumped back, and I saw him stumble, his face twisted in anger. I didn't stop. I shifted into drive and swung the car around, squeezing past his without caring about the scratches or the noise of metal grinding. I just needed to get out of there. I got back onto the main road, my tires spinning on the gravel, but I didn't slow down. I looked in the mirror, and he was standing there in the dust, watching me go. His car stayed put, and I didn't see him move. I drove until I found another road, something that would take me back toward civilization, back toward lights and people. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station miles away, where there were other cars and a clerk behind the counter. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I parked and sat there for a while, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I checked my car, and sure enough, one of my tires had been slashed, a deep cut right in the sidewall. He must have done it when I lost sight of him. I don't know what he wanted or why he was following me, but I know it wasn't anything good. I told the station clerk about it, but all they could do was call the local sheriff. By the time anyone got out there, he was gone. I kept thinking about how close he was, how he just watched me the whole time like he was waiting for something. I've driven that road 100 times since, but now I'm always looking over my shoulder, always checking my mirrors, because you never know who's out there or what they might want. I don't drive at night anymore if I can help it, and I keep thinking about how it could have ended if I hadn't acted when I did. I'd been living in my apartment for about 6 months when I first noticed things weren't right. It wasn't anything big, just small stuff at first. I'd come home from work, and my bedroom door would be open when I knew I'd left it closed. I thought maybe I was just rushing in the morning and not paying attention. But then it started happening more. I'd shut a door, and the next day it would be open again. I blamed myself. I was tired all the time from work, stressed out, maybe not thinking straight. Then it was the food. One night, I opened the fridge, and the milk was almost gone. I lived alone, didn't have anyone over, and I hadn't used it. I tried to convince myself that maybe I'd just forgotten drinking it. But it wasn't just the milk. Sometimes it was bread, sometimes leftovers. Little things disappearing. I even started writing things down, like I'd make a note of what I ate just to prove to myself I wasn't losing it. But every time, the food still went missing. I thought about calling my landlord, but what was I going to say? I'd sound crazy telling him I thought someone was sneaking into my place just to take food. The building was old, and the locks were kind of cheap, but it was New York. I figured maybe I just had to be more careful, so I started double-checking the door, making sure it was locked every night before I went to bed. Still, things kept happening. One night, I was watching TV when I heard a faint noise from my bedroom, like a soft click or a scrape. I paused the show, but when I listened, it was dead quiet. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the building settling or something. Old buildings make noise, right? But after that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started feeling uneasy in my own home, like I was being watched, but there was no one there. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just my nerves. A few nights later, I came home, and all the lights were on. I always turned them off when I left, every time. My heart sank. I walked through the apartment, checking each room, but nothing looked out of place, and nothing was missing. I stood in my living room, feeling like I was going crazy. I didn't know what to do. I even checked the locks again, but they were fine, nothing broken. It made no sense. I felt this chill down my spine, like something was very wrong. It got worse. I'd hear footsteps above me when the tenant upstairs wasn't home, or the faint sound of something dragging across the floor. But when I'd go upstairs, there was nothing. One morning, I found a cup in the sink that I hadn't used. It wasn't dirty, just wet, like someone had rinsed it out. I tried calling my mom, just to talk, but I didn't tell her what was going on. I didn't want her to worry or think I'd lost my mind. The next night, I was trying to sleep, but I couldn't stop feeling like someone was watching me. I tossed and turned, and when I finally fell asleep, I woke up a couple of hours later to this low creaking sound. It was coming from the closet. I lay there, frozen, staring at the door. I wanted to get up and check, but I was too scared to move. I just lay there, listening, until I finally fell asleep from exhaustion. The breaking point came when I found the camera. I was cleaning my room on a Saturday, dusting and straightening things up. When I went to adjust a picture frame on my dresser, I noticed something behind it, this tiny black device, tucked just out of sight. I picked it up, and my stomach dropped. It was a small camera, the kind you see in spy movies. It was aimed right at my bed. My hands were shaking as I turned it over, trying to figure out where it came from or how long it had been there. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there staring at it, trying to piece it all together. Someone had been watching me in my own home, maybe for weeks. I felt violated, exposed. I tore through the rest of the apartment, checking every corner, every crevice, looking for more cameras or anything that didn't belong. I found another one in the living room, hidden in a potted plant facing the couch. I couldn't believe it. It was like my whole apartment wasn't mine anymore. It was theirs, whoever they were. I called the police, and they came by to check everything out. They asked me a million questions. Had I noticed anyone strange around the building? Had I given anyone access to my apartment? I hadn't. They took the cameras with them, but they didn't give me any answers. Just told me to be careful and that they'd investigate. It wasn't exactly reassuring. They didn't even change the locks. They just said they'd keep an eye on things. I started staying at a friend's place after that. I couldn't sleep in my apartment anymore. I kept thinking about all the times I'd been in my bedroom, changing clothes, lying in bed, completely unaware. Every time I heard those noises, or the lights had been on, or the food had gone missing, it was them. Whoever had been watching me had been in my home, moving around, maybe even while I was there. A couple of days later, my landlord called. He said someone had been caught trying to get into my building, an old tenant who'd been evicted months ago but still had a key. He'd been squatting in the basement, sneaking up into apartments when people were out, stealing food and God knows what else. They found a mattress down there, along with more cameras and tools. The landlord apologized, but it didn't make me feel any better. I went back to the apartment once, just to grab my things. I couldn't stay there anymore. I felt sick just walking through the door, knowing the guy had been watching me. I packed everything in a rush, throwing clothes into bags, not caring about what I left behind. The place felt tainted, like I couldn't breathe the air in there without feeling dirty. I moved out by the end of the week. I found a new place across town, somewhere with security cameras and a doorman. It's better, but I still have trouble sleeping. Every little noise makes me jump, and I keep checking the closets, the doors, making sure no one's there. I put tape over the camera on my laptop, and I don't let anyone into my new place if I can help it. I keep thinking about all the times I brushed things off, telling myself it was nothing, that I was just tired or forgetful. But it was real. I wasn't alone in that apartment. He was there, watching, waiting. I don't know what he would have done if I hadn't found those cameras when I did, and I try not to think about it. I just hope I never have to feel that way again, trapped, scared, not knowing who's watching. I was out on my usual delivery route that day, hitting all the same streets I'd driven down 100 times before. It was a quiet neighborhood, nice houses lined up with perfectly trimmed lawns, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. I had a few more stops to go before my shift ended, and I was ready to get it done and head home. When I pulled up to this one house, it looked like nobody was home. Lights were off, no cars in the driveway. Just your standard delivery. I grabbed the package from the back of my truck, a medium-sized box, nothing special, didn't weigh much, and walked up to the front door. I rang the bell and waited, like I always did. Nobody answered. I waited a bit longer, knocked on the door just in case. Still nothing. It was a typical day, nothing unusual, so I set the package down on the porch and started to head back to the truck. That's when I heard it. There was this faint noise coming from inside the house. It sounded like something fell, maybe a thud or a knock. I stopped and turned around, glancing at the windows. Everything seemed normal at first, but then I caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow or something, quick, like someone ducking out of sight. I squinted, trying to see better, but the curtains were half drawn, and all I could make out was a dark shape just beyond the glass. I thought maybe someone was home after all, just being shy, or maybe didn't hear me knocking the first time. So I walked back up and called out, "Hey, I've got a package here." No response. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't really explain why. It wasn't like anything bad had happened. I just had this weird feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. I turned to leave again, trying to shake it off, but then I noticed the figure again. This time, it was clearer. A man, standing just inside the window, watching me. He didn't wave, didn't move, just stared. He was tall, thin, with this pale face that looked almost grayish in the dim light of the house. I couldn't make out any details, but his eyes, I could feel them locked on me. It was like he didn't blink or move at all, just kept watching. I felt this chill crawl up my spine, and I quickly got back to the truck, telling myself it was nothing. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the guy come out onto the porch, but he never did. I brushed it off and kept going with my route, trying to forget about it. But I couldn't shake that feeling. Something about the way he was just standing there, silent, like he was waiting for something. I finished my deliveries, but I kept thinking about that house, that man in the window. Later that night, when I was back at the depot sorting through the last of the paperwork, this guy walked up to me. I hadn't seen him before. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and looked like he didn't belong there. He asked if I was the one who made the delivery to that house earlier, gave me the exact address. I didn't see any harm in admitting it, so I said yeah, that was me. His face didn't change. He just stared at me, kind of like the guy in the window had, with this cold, blank look. He asked me what I'd seen, and I told him just what I saw, a man in the window, nothing else. The guy stepped closer, way too close, and his voice got low. He said I shouldn't have looked, that I shouldn't have seen anything. I laughed it off, but he didn't. He was dead serious. He said I needed to forget about it, that it wasn't my business. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I'd never felt threatened on the job before, but this guy, he was different. I told him I didn't see anything, and I tried to walk away, but he grabbed my arm, hard enough that it hurt. He leaned in close and whispered, "You delivered something you shouldn't have." I pulled away, but his grip didn't let go at first. I had to jerk my arm free. He didn't follow me, just stood there, watching me with this intense, angry stare. It was like he was daring me to say something more, but I didn't. I just got in my truck and drove off, my heart pounding. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that delivery. I looked up the address online, trying to figure out who lived there, but I couldn't find much. Just a name, nothing else. No photos, no social media, nothing that stood out. It was like the house didn't really exist beyond that street. I kept replaying the whole thing in my head, the man in the window, the stranger's warning. I couldn't make sense of any of it. I even drove by the house again, just to see if I could spot anything. It looked the same as before, quiet and empty. I didn't see the man in the window this time, but that didn't make me feel any better. I stayed in my truck, engine running, half expecting someone to come out and yell at me, but no one did. I finally left, feeling more confused than ever. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the stranger's voice, the way he told me I delivered something I shouldn't have. What did he mean by that? I had no answers, just more questions. The next morning, I found a note on my windshield. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper. It was written in messy, rushed handwriting. Mind your business. Don't go back. That was it. No signature, no explanation. I tried telling myself it was just a prank, but I knew it wasn't. I didn't know who left it, but I had a feeling it was connected to that house. I stopped driving by after that. I didn't want to push my luck. I even considered reporting it to the police, but what would I say? That some guy was mad about a delivery? They'd laughed me out of the station. A few weeks went by, and I thought maybe it was over. I went back to my usual routes, avoiding that neighborhood. But one evening, as I was finishing up my last delivery, I saw the same man from the depot standing across the street, watching me. He didn't approach this time, just stood there, like he was reminding me he hadn't forgotten. I quickly finished my drop-off and got out of there, trying not to show how rattled I was. I haven't seen him since, but every time I go to work, I feel like I'm being watched. Like he's out there, waiting. I never figured out what was in that package or why it mattered so much. I still think about the man in the window, and I wonder if he's still there, watching the street, waiting for the next delivery. I keep my head down now, do my job, and try not to look too closely at anything. I don't want to know what I saw that day. I don't want to know what I delivered. I just want to do my job and get home without feeling like someone's following me. I went hiking alone that day, something I'd done plenty of times before. It was supposed to be an easy trail, one I'd hiked a few times, just to clear my head. I liked the quiet, the fresh air, and the feeling of being away from everything for a while. I parked at the usual spot, laced up my boots, and started walking. It was a nice day, clear skies, cool breeze, perfect for a hike. I had my water, some snacks, and a map I'd printed out. I wasn't worried about anything. About an hour in, I noticed a narrow path off to the side, just barely visible between the trees. It wasn't marked on my map, but it looked like it had been used before, with faint tracks in the dirt. I figured it was just an unofficial trail, maybe something that led to a better view or a quiet spot off the main path. I stood there for a second, looking at it, and decided to take it. It was broad daylight, and I wasn't in a rush, so why not explore a little? The further I walked, the quieter it got. The sounds of other hikers faded away, and soon it was just the crunch of my boots and the wind rustling through the branches. I liked it at first, the feeling of being alone in the woods, like I had the whole place to myself. The trail wound deeper into the trees, and I had to step over fallen logs and duck under branches, but it was still easy enough to follow. I checked my phone to see if I had a signal, but it was already gone. I wasn't surprised. Reception out there was always spotty. After about 20 minutes, I started noticing things. First, it was a torn piece of fabric hanging off a bush, like from a jacket or a backpack. It was dirty, faded, and looked like it had been there for a while. I thought it was odd, but didn't think much of it. A little further along, I found a water bottle lying on the ground, half buried in the dirt. It was crushed and old, the kind you buy at a gas station, not the kind hikers usually carry. I kicked it aside and kept going. The trail started to feel less like a trail and more like a path that had been made by someone cutting through the woods. It was narrow and winding, and I noticed footprints, but they weren't fresh. They were faint, almost washed away by rain and time. That's when I started feeling uneasy, like maybe I'd gone too far. I pulled out my map again, but the trail wasn't on it. I figured I just missed it somehow, or maybe it was too small to be marked. I told myself I'd go just a little further and then turn back. Then I saw the backpack. It was half buried under a pile of leaves, old and dirty. It looked like it had been there a long time. I nudged it with my boot, and it fell open. Inside were some clothes, a few granola bars, and a torn-up map, but everything was damp and ruined. It didn't look like anyone had used it in ages. I felt this tight feeling in my chest, like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to. It wasn't normal for someone to leave a backpack like that, just abandoned in the middle of nowhere. I decided it was time to head back. I turned around, but the trail looked different. I couldn't see where I'd come from. The trees were dense, and everything looked the same, just endless woods in every direction. I tried to retrace my steps, but I kept getting turned around. My heart started racing, and I could feel the panic setting in. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I wasn't lost, that I just needed to pay attention and keep moving. But the more I walked, the more I realized I was going deeper, not back the way I came. I stopped to catch my breath and listen. That's when I heard it, a soft crunch, like footsteps, not far behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. I called out, hoping it was another hiker, but no one answered. I stood there, frozen, straining to hear anything else, but all I got was silence. My mind was racing with every worst-case scenario, thinking maybe it was an animal or just my imagination. I picked up the pace, practically jogging now, trying to find any sign of the main trail. But the more I moved, the more I felt like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like eyes were on me, hidden somewhere in the thick woods. Every little noise made me jump, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. It all sounded too close, too deliberate. Then I found the campsite. If you could even call it that. It was more like a few bits of old gear scattered around a collapsed tent, a rusted canteen, and some half-burned pieces of wood that used to be a fire pit. It looked abandoned, like whoever had been there left in a hurry. I didn't want to stay and figure out why. There was a notebook on the ground, pages torn and smeared, like it had been out there for months. I flipped through it, but most of it was unreadable, just scribbles and water stains. The parts one could read didn't make sense, random words, numbers, like someone was jotting down thoughts in a panic. I was about to leave when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a flash of something between the trees. I looked up, and there he was, a man, standing maybe 50 feet away. He was wearing a dark jacket, dirty jeans, and he had this wild look in his eyes, like he hadn't seen another person in a long time. I froze. He didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I called out, asking if he was lost or needed help, but he didn't answer. He just smiled this crooked, unsettling smile. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted to get away from him. I sprinted through the woods, branches scraping my arms and face. I kept glancing back, and every time, he was closer, moving fast but never making a sound. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I knew I had to get back to the main trail, but everything looked the same, and I couldn't find my way. I stumbled and fell, landing hard on my hands and knees. When I looked up, he was right there, just a few feet away. He didn't say anything, just kept that same eerie smile. I scrambled back to my feet and kept running, feeling like he was right on my heels. I didn't stop until I saw a clearing ahead, a glimpse of sunlight that told me I was close to the main path. I burst out of the trees, nearly collapsing onto the trail. I looked around, but there were no other hikers, no one I could call for help. I turned back, expecting to see him step out of the woods, but he never did. The trees just stood there, quiet and still, like nothing had happened. I ran the rest of the way back to my car, not stopping until I was inside with the doors locked. I sat there, shaking, staring at the tree line, half expecting him to come out at any moment. But he never did. I don't know who he was or why he was out there, but I'm sure of one thing: I wasn't supposed to find that trail. I wasn't supposed to see him. I reported it to the park rangers the next day, but they didn't find anything. No signs of the campsite, no man, nothing. They said I must have taken a wrong turn, but I know what I saw. I know that trail isn't on any map for a reason. I haven't gone hiking alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. My friend Tom and I were on a road trip, just trying to get away for a bit. We've been driving all day, taking back roads, just going wherever the car took us. It was late when we pulled into this small town in Maine. I don't even remember the name of it. It wasn't on our map, and the sign was old and faded. It looked like one of those places that time forgot: quiet streets, old houses, and hardly anyone around. We were tired and needed somewhere to sleep, so we decided to stop there for the night. There was this little motel just off the main road. It was nothing fancy, just a row of old rooms with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign out front. The kind of place you'd only stay in if you had no other choice. We parked the car, grabbed our stuff, and went inside. The guy at the front desk looked half asleep when we walked in. He barely said anything, just handed us a key and pointed us to our room. The whole place smelled damp, like it hadn't been cleaned in a while, but we didn't care. We just wanted to crash. After we threw our bags in the room, Tom said he was going to go out and grab some stuff, snacks, drinks, whatever we needed for the night. He said he saw a little convenience store down the street when we drove in. I told him I'd wait in the room and get things sorted out. I remember watching him walk out the door, joking about how he'd probably come back with all junk food and nothing useful. I didn't think much of it at the time. I sat around for a while, flipping through channels on the old TV that barely worked. I must have dozed off because when I checked my watch, nearly an hour had passed. Tom still wasn't back. I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I figured he must have just gotten distracted or was taking his time, but something didn't feel right. I threw on my jacket and decided to go look for him. The town was dark and quiet, hardly any streetlights, and most of the buildings were shut. I walked down the road to where the store was supposed to be, but when I got there, it was closed. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of anyone inside. I knocked on the glass a couple of times, just in case, but nobody answered. I tried calling Tom again, nothing. I started feeling uneasy. He wouldn't just leave without saying something. I walked around for a bit, checking the few places that were still open, but nobody had seen him. The people I talked to were strange, too. They barely looked at me, acted like they didn't want to talk. I asked this older guy sitting outside a diner if he'd seen my friend, but he just shrugged and said, "People come and go around here. Best not to worry." His tone was off, like he was hiding something. I started to get frustrated. It felt like everyone was keeping something from me. I went back to the motel and asked the guy at the front desk if Tom had come back while I was out. He just looked at me blankly and shook his head. He seemed annoyed, like I was bothering him by asking. I couldn't figure out why everyone was acting so weird. It wasn't like Tom to just disappear, and the more I tried to get answers, the more the people in town seemed to shut me out. I decided to walk back toward the store again, thinking maybe I'd missed something. As I was heading down the street, I noticed a man watching me from across the road. He was standing in the shadow of an alley, just barely visible, but I could feel his eyes on me. When I turned to look, he stepped back, like he didn't want to be seen. It sent a chill down my spine. I called out, asking if he'd seen my friend, but he just disappeared into the dark. By this point, I was getting desperate. I went into the diner to ask the waitress if she'd seen Tom, but she acted like she didn't even hear me. She just kept wiping the counter, staring off like she was in her own world. It was like everyone in that town was on edge, like they were all in on something that I wasn't supposed to know about. I walked around some more, checking every corner, every alley, but there was no sign of Tom. I started knocking on doors, asking anyone who would answer if they'd seen him. Most people just looked annoyed or confused. A couple of them even slammed the door in my face without saying a word. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. As I walked past the store again, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small side door, tucked away in the shadows. It was slightly open, just enough to make me think someone had been in there recently. I pushed it open and stepped inside. It was dark, the only light coming from a dim bulb flickering above. I called out Tom's name, but there was no answer, just the sound of dripping water somewhere in the back. I walked deeper into the room, feeling my way through the dark. The place was a mess, shelves knocked over, stuff scattered everywhere. It looked like it hadn't been used in ages. That's when I noticed a pile of clothes on the floor, half covered in dust and dirt. My heart sank. They were Tom's. His jacket, his backpack, everything he'd been wearing when he left the motel. I grabbed the clothes and ran outside, my mind racing. I knew something was very wrong, and I wasn't safe there. I went straight back to the motel, ready to get out of that place. When I got to the front desk, the guy wasn't there anymore. I looked around, shouting for him, but there was no one. It was like the whole place had been abandoned. I rushed back to our room, but when I opened the door, I froze. The room was completely empty, no bags, no signs we'd ever been there. Even the bed was made, like no one had touched it. I felt like I was losing it. I ran back outside to the car, hoping Tom would somehow be there, but it was gone too. My car. I'd parked it right in front of the room, but now there was nothing. I stood there, alone, not knowing what to do. I looked around, and that's when I saw them, the people from the town, just standing there, watching me from the shadows. I recognized the guy from the diner, the old man from before, even the guy from the front desk. They were all there, silent, just staring. I shouted at them, asking where Tom was, but they didn't say anything. They just watched, like they were waiting for something. I backed away, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. I had no phone, no car, nothing. I just started running, not caring where I was going, just away from them. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town, and even then, I could feel their eyes on me. I kept running until I hit the main road and flagged down a passing car. The driver pulled over, and I practically threw myself inside, begging him to take me anywhere but there. I reported Tom missing as soon as I got to the nearest police station, but they didn't seem too interested. They took my statement, asked a few questions, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard back. I tried calling, following up, but it was like the town didn't even exist. They couldn't find it on any map, and no one knew what I was talking about. I still don't know what happened to Tom. I don't know what that town was or why everyone was acting so strange. All I know is I left with nothing, and I haven't seen my friend since. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, but it never makes any sense. It's like that whole place was some kind of trap, and we just happened to stumble into it. I wish we'd never stopped. I wish we just kept driving. I checked into the hotel late that night. It was a small place, nothing fancy, just a budget hotel off the highway in Florida. The kind of place you stay when you're just passing through and need somewhere to sleep. I had been driving all day, and all I wanted was to shower and get some rest. The clerk at the front desk was polite enough, though a bit distracted, barely looking up as he handed me the key to room 107. The room was as plain as I expected. A queen-sized bed, a small TV, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. But it was clean, and that's all I cared about. I locked the door, set my bag on the chair, and headed to the bathroom to wash up. The water was hot, and for a moment, I felt the day's exhaustion start to melt away. As I got out of the shower, I heard a noise. It was faint, like something moving in the room next to mine. I figured it was just another guest, maybe someone getting settled in like I was. But the noise didn't stop. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, and it made me pause. I dried off quickly and got dressed, all the while listening to that sound. The walls in these places are thin, so I thought I'd just call the front desk and ask them to check it out. I didn't want to be the person who complained about a little noise, but it was getting under my skin. When I called, the same clerk answered. I explained what I was hearing, trying to be polite about it. He was silent for a moment, and then he told me something that sent a chill down my spine. He said the room next to mine, room 109, wasn't occupied. I tried to reason it away. Maybe he was mistaken, or maybe someone had checked in late without him noticing. But he insisted, almost too firmly, that the room was empty. He even offered to come up and check, but I declined, not wanting to make a fuss. Instead, I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall that separated me from room 109. The noise continued, that same dull thumping. It was like someone was pacing back and forth, dragging something with each step. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I told myself I was just curious, that I needed to know what was making the sound so I could relax and get some sleep. I grabbed my key and slipped out into the hallway. The corridor was dimly lit, with a row of identical doors stretching out in both directions. I stood outside room 109, feeling foolish and more than a little nervous. The door was slightly ajar, not enough to see inside but enough to tell it hadn't been closed properly. I hesitated, thinking about going back to my room and pretending I hadn't heard anything. But then the sound came again, louder this time, like something was being dragged right up to the door. My hand moved on its own, pushing the door open just a crack more, just enough to peek inside. The room was dark, but the light from the hallway cast a thin strip of brightness across the floor. That's when I saw it, a pair of feet, bare and dirty, sticking out from the edge of the bed. The rest of the body was hidden in the shadows, but I could tell something was wrong. The legs were bent at an unnatural angle, like they'd been twisted or broken. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, to slam the door and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but I couldn't move. My eyes were glued to those feet, to the way they were just there, motionless. Then, suddenly, the thumping stopped. The silence was worse, filling the room like a weight pressing down on me. I felt like I was being watched, like something was waiting for me to step inside, to cross that line between the safety of the hallway and the darkness of the room. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at those feet, but eventually, I forced myself to back away. I didn't turn around. I just moved slowly, one step at a time, until I was back in my own room. My hands were shaking as I locked the door behind me, and I could barely breathe, my chest tight with fear. I sat on the bed, staring at the phone, wondering if I should call the police. But then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a faint creak, like the sound of a door slowly closing. I listened, heart pounding, as the door to room 109 clicked shut, followed by the soft pad of footsteps moving down the hall. I didn't dare move. I didn't want to know who or what had been in that room with me, or where they were going now. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear any sound, any clue that might tell me they were gone. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and the hotel was quiet again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was still out there, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even get under the covers. I just sat there in the dark, wide awake until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. As soon as it was light enough, I packed my things and left. I didn't stop at the front desk, didn't ask any more questions. I just got in my car and drove, leaving that place far behind me. Even now, I can't stop thinking about those feet, about the sound of something being dragged across the floor. I don't know what I saw, or who was in that room, but I know I was lucky to get out of there. Some things are better left alone. I was up in Montana for a hunting trip, staying in a small cabin my friend lent me. It was as remote as you could get, no cell service, no neighbors for miles, just me in the woods. I liked it that way, to be honest. It was peaceful, and after a long day of tracking game, all I wanted was to relax and get some sleep. The cabin wasn't much, just one room with a bed, a wood stove, and a little kitchen area. I'd spent most of the day outside, came back around dusk, and after a simple dinner, I turned in early. The fire was still burning low in the stove, and the wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees. I drifted off pretty quickly, the kind of deep sleep that comes when you're completely exhausted. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I heard it, a loud, insistent knocking on the door. It yanked me out of sleep like a slap to the face. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to shake off the confusion. The knocking came again, harder this time, followed by a voice. Hey! Hey, man, open up. I need help. The voice was muffled but close, just on the other side of the door. I grabbed a flashlight from the table by the bed and switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The cabin was cold now, the fire almost out, and my breath came out in visible puffs as I made my way to the door. Who is it? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. My car broke down, the man said. I've been walking for miles. Please, just let me in. There was something off about the way he spoke. His tone was urgent, but there was a weird edge to it, almost like he was hiding something. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, every instinct telling me not to open it. You can't stay here, I said, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. There's a town about 10 miles down the road. You can get help there. The knocking stopped, and for a second, I thought he might have left. But then he spoke again, this time louder, more aggressive. I'm not going anywhere, man. It's freezing out here. Open the damn door. I felt a surge of fear then, cold and sharp in my gut. This wasn't right. Something was very wrong with this guy. I backed away from the door, flashlight shaking in my hand as I tried to think of what to do next. I hadn't brought a gun, didn't think I'd need one. Now I wished I had. The man started pounding on the door with both fists, the sound echoing through the cabin. He was shouting now, calling me all sorts of things, demanding I let him in. I knew I couldn't let that happen. I'd read enough stories, seen enough news reports to know that this was how people ended up dead. I looked around the cabin, trying to figure out if there was another way out. But the windows were too small, and there was only the one door. My only option was to barricade myself in and hope he'd give up before breaking down the door. I grabbed a chair and jammed it under the doorknob, then piled whatever I could find in front of it, my pack, the table, anything that might slow him down. All the while, he kept banging on the door, the wood creaking under the strain. "Let me in," he screamed. "You don't know what you're doing." I crouched behind the bed, the only place that felt remotely safe. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. There was no phone, no way to call for help. All I could do was wait, hope he'd get tired or someone else might come along, though I knew that was unlikely. The banging stopped suddenly, and the silence was almost worse. I strained to hear, but there was nothing, just the wind outside. I didn't dare move, every muscle tensed, listening for any sign that he was still out there. Minutes passed, maybe more, and just when I started to think he might have left, I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like metal against wood. My blood ran cold. He was trying to pry the door open. I pressed myself tighter against the bed, trying to make myself as small as possible. The sound of the metal scraping continued, slow and deliberate, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I could picture him out there, a twisted grin on his face as he worked the door open. Then, just as quickly as it started, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with tension. I held my breath, waiting for whatever would come next. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and the door splintered inward, the chair skidding across the floor. He'd forced his way in. I could hear his heavy breathing, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor as he stepped inside. "Where are you?" he taunted, his voice dripping with malice. "You can't hide from me." I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The beam of his flashlight swept across the room, missing me by inches. He was so close I could hear the rustle of his clothes, the sound of his boots creaking with every step. He moved slowly through the cabin, searching, his flashlight flicking over the walls, the furniture, the bed. I knew it was only a matter of time before he found me, and when he did, I had no idea what he'd do. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Then, by some miracle, the beam of his flashlight swung away from me. He muttered something under his breath, frustrated, and I heard him move towards the door. I didn't dare move, not yet, not until I was sure he was gone. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, as if debating whether to come back in. Then, finally, he stepped outside, the door creaking as it swung shut behind him. I stayed frozen in place, waiting, listening for any sign that he might return. It felt like hours before I finally dared to move. My legs were stiff from crouching, my whole body trembling with fear. I crawled out from behind the bed, careful not to make a sound, and crept towards the door. The cabin was empty, but the door was hanging off its hinges, the lock completely shattered. I peeked outside, half expecting to see him waiting for me, but the night was still and quiet, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my pack, stuffed whatever I could into it, and left the cabin as quickly and quietly as I could. My truck was parked a little ways down the road, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, terrified that he might come after me. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my bag in the back, jumped in, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I sped down the road, the cabin and that nightmarish encounter fading into the distance. It wasn't until I was miles away, the cabin far behind me, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. I bought an old house in Massachusetts, one of those places that had been around for over 100 years. It was the kind of place that looked like it had stories to tell. I thought it would be a good project, something to keep me busy for a while, fixing it up and maybe even uncovering a bit of history along the way. Most of the house was in decent shape, just needed some fresh paint, new floors, that sort of thing. But there was one door on the second floor that wouldn't budge. It was heavy and locked tight, and I couldn't find a key for it anywhere. It led to the attic, or at least I assumed it did. I didn't think much of it at first, figured I'd deal with it later. Weeks went by as I worked on the house. I'd started feeling more and more uneasy, though. It wasn't something I could put my finger on. Just a feeling like I was being watched. Sometimes, while I was downstairs, I'd hear a creak from above, like footsteps, but I'd always chalked it up to the old house settling. Old houses made noises, right? Finally, one day I decided to tackle the locked door. I figured it was just stuck or painted shut, so I got a crowbar and some tools and went to work on it. After a lot of prying and cursing under my breath, I managed to get it open. The door swung wide, and a musty smell hit me like a wall. It was dark inside, and my flashlight barely cut through the gloom. The attic was huge, with old furniture covered in sheets, stacks of boxes, and a thick layer of dust on everything. The kind of place where time seemed to have stopped. I started poking around, pulling sheets off the furniture and looking through some of the boxes. There were family photos in there, black and white, faded with age. Pictures of people who used to live in the house, I guessed. One picture caught my eye. It was a portrait of a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl. They looked like any other family from back then, but there was something about the way they were posed, their expressions. The man's hand was gripping the woman's shoulder too tightly, and the little girl wasn't smiling, just staring straight ahead with these big, dark eyes. As I looked through more of the boxes, I found a small wooden chest hidden under an old blanket. It was locked, too, but the key was lying right next to it. I almost didn't want to open it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, there were more photos, but these were different. They were wrong. The little girl from the portrait was in them, but she wasn't smiling in any of them. Some of the photos showed her alone, in strange places, like she was being hidden. Others had her with a man and woman, but they weren't the same as in the portrait. The woman looked scared, and the man, his eyes were cold, almost angry. Then I found a journal, tucked away at the bottom of the chest. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic. It was the woman's, the mother's, and it was like reading someone's descent into madness. She wrote about the man, how he wasn't who he seemed, how he'd hurt them, and how she was too afraid to leave. The last entry was smudged, like she'd been crying as she wrote it. She talked about the little girl, how she needed to protect her, and how she couldn't let him take her. I felt sick reading it. I wanted to stop, but I kept going, driven by some horrible need to know what had happened. There were no dates, nothing to tell me when this all took place, but it felt like it could have been yesterday. The woman wrote about hiding in the attic, about how the man would come up there looking for them, how she could hear him calling their names. The air in the attic felt heavy, like I wasn't alone. I turned to leave, but then I heard a faint creak behind me. I whipped around, flashlight swinging, but there was nothing there. Just the dusty old furniture and boxes. But the feeling that someone was there wouldn't go away. I started backing towards the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to be up there anymore. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The dust on the floor, it was disturbed. There were footprints in it, leading away from where I was standing, towards a dark corner of the attic. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The footprints were fresh, too fresh. Someone else had been up here, maybe still was. I didn't wait to find out. I bolted for the door, not caring about the noise I made, just wanting to get out of there. I ran down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone. No signal, of course. I felt exposed, like whoever had been in that attic was watching me, maybe even waiting for me to come back inside. I didn't sleep that night. I locked myself in my car, too scared to go back into the house. I could still see the attic window from where I was sitting, and every time I looked at it, I felt like something was looking back at me. The next morning, I went back inside, only to grab my things. I didn't care about finishing the renovations, didn't care about anything except getting out of there. I sold the house as quickly as I could, didn't even go back for the rest of my stuff. I didn't tell the new owners about the attic, about the journal, or the photos. I couldn't. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just an old house with a tragic past, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that someone was in that attic with me, someone who didn't want me there. I wonder sometimes what happened to that little girl, if she ever got away, but deep down, I think I know the answer. I had just moved into the house a few weeks ago. It was in one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods, the kind where nothing much happens, and everyone keeps to themselves. The place wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, and I liked the idea of having my own space. I spent the first few days getting settled, unpacking boxes, and making it feel like home. It was late one night, probably around midnight, and I was in the living room, trying to unwind after a long day at work. The TV was on, but I wasn't really watching it. I was just kind of zoning out, you know? It was peaceful, and I was finally starting to feel comfortable in the new place. That's when I heard it, a sound from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a stray animal. But then I heard it again, louder this time, like something was scraping against the door. My heart started to race, and I muted the TV to listen more closely. There was definitely something or someone out there. I got up and crept over to the front window, peeking out through the blinds. I could see a figure standing on my front porch, their face hidden in the shadows. My stomach dropped. It was a man, and he was just standing there, facing the door, like he was waiting for something. I watched him for a few seconds, hoping he would just go away, but he didn't move. Then he started knocking, first lightly, then harder. It was a slow, deliberate knock, like he had all the time in the world. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't recognize him, and I had no idea why he was there. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to just ignore it, but something about the way he was knocking, so steady and patient, made me feel like he wasn't going to leave. I finally worked up the courage to go to the door, but I didn't open it. I just stood on the other side, my hand hovering over the lock, trying to decide what to say. Before I could speak, I heard him. "Open the door," he said, his voice muffled through the wood. "I need to come in." My breath caught in my throat. There was something off about his voice, something flat and cold. I didn't answer him, hoping he would take the hint and go away, but he just kept knocking. "It's my house," he said, louder this time. "You need to let me in." I finally found my voice, though it came out shaky. "You have the wrong house," I told him. "This isn't your house. You need to leave." There was a pause, and I thought maybe he would leave after all. But then he started pounding on the door, harder and harder, like he was trying to break it down. "This is my house," he shouted. "I know you're in there. You don't belong here." Panic took over. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling so much I could barely hit the buttons. As I waited for the operator to pick up, I backed away from the door, my eyes locked on it, expecting it to burst open at any moment. When the operator answered, I told her what was happening as quickly as I could, my words tumbling out in a rush. She told me to stay calm, that she was sending someone right away, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. To her, it probably just sounded like a drunk or a prankster, but I knew something was wrong. The man kept yelling, his voice getting more and more unhinged. He started saying things that didn't make any sense, like how he remembered where everything was in the house, how he had lived there for years. He was pounding on the door so hard now that I could see it shaking in its frame. I didn't know what to do. The operator was still on the line, telling me help was on the way, but it didn't feel like it would be fast enough. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my only thought being that I needed something to protect myself with. The man kept shouting, and then, all of a sudden, he stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I stood there, holding the knife, trying to hear if he was still out there. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely think. Then I heard the doorknob rattle, and I realized with horror that he was trying to pick the lock. He was going to get in. I ran upstairs, locking myself in the bathroom, my phone clutched in one hand and the knife in the other. I could hear him downstairs, the sound of the door finally giving way and crashing open. He was in the house. I could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, just like his knocking had been. He started talking again, his voice echoing through the house. "I'm home," he kept saying, like he was convincing himself. "I'm finally home." I was shaking so badly I thought I might drop the phone. The operator was trying to talk to me, but I couldn't focus on her words. All I could think about was the man getting closer, hearing his footsteps on the stairs, knowing he was coming for me. Then I heard the sirens, faint at first, but getting louder. The man must have heard them too because his footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet, and I thought maybe he had left. But then I heard him start to move again, faster this time, like he was searching for something. I heard him go back downstairs, and then there was the sound of the front door slamming. I stayed in the bathroom, too scared to move until I heard the police banging on the door, calling out for me. When I finally came out, they were there, guns drawn, sweeping through the house. But the man was gone. They didn't find him. There were no fingerprints, no sign of him at all except for the door, which was hanging off its hinges. The police said it was probably just some guy who was on something, but I knew it was more than that. He wasn't just some random intruder. He really believed this was his house, that I had no right to be there. I never stayed in that house again. I couldn't. Every time I thought about it, I could still hear him, still feel him out there, waiting. I sold the place as fast as I could and got out of there, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, looking for me, convinced that I took something that was his. I had been looking forward to the weekend alone in the cabin for weeks. It was supposed to be a quiet break from everything, a chance to relax and clear my head. The cabin was deep in the woods, far enough from town that I wouldn't be bothered by anyone. The snow had started falling earlier in the day, and by the time night came, the whole place was buried in a thick blanket of white. I had a fire going, the only light in the room coming from the flickering flames. It was peaceful. I was sitting in the armchair, a blanket wrapped around me, just enjoying the silence. The wind howled outside, and every now and then, the trees would creak under the weight of the snow. But inside, it was warm and quiet. I was almost drifting off to sleep when I heard a knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost like I imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. I sat up, my heart starting to race. Nobody was supposed to be out here. The nearest cabin was miles away, and the snow was coming down hard. I wondered if I had heard it right, but then the knock came again, slow and deliberate. I got up, my legs feeling a little shaky, and made my way to the door. There was no peephole, just a solid wooden door between me and whoever was outside. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, and for a moment, I thought maybe they had left. But then I heard a voice, muffled by the door. "I'm lost. Please, can I come in? It's freezing out here." The voice sounded off, like there was something not right about it. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. I knew it was freezing outside. Anyone caught out in this storm wouldn't last long. But there was something about the way he spoke that made me uneasy. He didn't sound scared or desperate, just flat. Emotionless. "How did you get here?" I asked, still not opening the door. "I got turned around," he said, his voice a little louder now, but still with that odd, flat tone. "I've been out here for hours. Please, just let me in. I need to warm up." Something in my gut was telling me not to open the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I looked around the cabin, thinking about my options. I didn't have a phone signal out here, and there was no way I could make it back to town in the snowstorm. If this guy was dangerous, I was on my own. But if I left him out there, I couldn't just let someone freeze to death, could I? I was torn. I didn't know what to do. I could hear the wind howling outside, and the image of someone collapsing in the snow, just a few feet from the warmth of the fire, flashed through my mind. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Are you alone?" I asked. There was another pause, longer this time. "Yes," he finally said. "Please, I'm alone. Just let me in." The way he hesitated before answering sent a chill down my spine. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe he really was just a lost hiker, desperate to get out of the cold. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I opened that door, I would regret it. "I can't let you in," I said, my voice firmer now. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you." There was silence on the other side. For a moment, I thought maybe he had given up and left. But then he started knocking again, harder this time, almost frantic. "Please," he said, his voice rising. "You have to let me in. I'm going to die out here." His tone had changed now, more desperate, but still, something didn't sit right with me. I felt like a monster, standing there with the warmth of the fire at my back, while someone begged for help on the other side of the door. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't let him in. "Go to the next cabin," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's not far from here. They can help you." "No," he snapped, his voice suddenly harsh. "You're the only one. I know you're alone in there. Let me in." My blood ran cold. How did he know I was alone? I hadn't said anything about being by myself. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything over the sound of my own pulse. I backed away from the door, the panic rising in my chest. "Leave now," I shouted, trying to sound as forceful as I could. "I'm not letting you in." There was a long silence, and I held my breath, waiting for his next move. Finally, I heard him speak again, but this time, his voice was low and cold, almost a whisper. "You'll regret this." I stood there, frozen, listening to the sound of his footsteps crunching in the snow as he walked away. I didn't move for what felt like hours, just staring at the door, waiting for him to come back. But the knocking didn't start again. Eventually, I forced myself to move, to check the windows and make sure they were locked. I went around the cabin, checking every door, every possible way in, until I was sure that everything was secure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. I sat up all night, the knife I kept for emergencies clutched in my hand, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, every gust of wind that sounded too much like footsteps in the snow. When the first light of dawn finally came, I was exhausted but still too scared to sleep. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, not caring that I was leaving early. I just wanted to get out of there. As I left the cabin, I glanced back at the door, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. But the porch was empty, the snow undisturbed. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of town. Even now, I can't stop thinking about that night, about the way his voice changed, the way he knew I was alone. I'll never know what he really wanted, but I'm glad I didn't open that door. I don't think I would have survived if I had. I was hauling a late-night load down a stretch of highway that felt like it would never end. It was one of those long, empty roads where you don't see another car for hours, just endless blacktop stretching out in front of you. The kind of road where you get lost in your thoughts, and the hum of the engine becomes a background noise that you barely notice. It was around 2 in the morning when I saw him standing by the side of the road. A lone figure in the darkness, his thumb out like something out of an old movie. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was the boredom, maybe just the thought of some company to keep me awake. I pulled the truck over, and he jogged up to the passenger side. He looked harmless enough. Mid-30s, maybe. Scruffy beard, wearing a faded jacket that had seen better days. He had a small backpack slung over one shoulder, nothing that screamed trouble. I rolled down the window, and he leaned in, giving me a tired smile. "Thanks, man," he said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. "Been out here for hours." I nodded and unlocked the door, letting him climb in. He tossed his bag on the floor and settled into the seat, letting out a sigh of relief. I glanced at him as I pulled back onto the highway. He looked worn out, eyes half closed, like he was ready to pass out right there. "Where are you headed?" I asked, just to make conversation. "Wherever you're going," he replied, staring out the windshield. "Anywhere's better than here." That should have been my first red flag, but I didn't think much of it at the time. We drove in silence for a while, the darkness outside pressing in on the cab. He didn't say much, just sat there staring straight ahead, his hands resting in his lap. Every now and then, I'd glance over, but he didn't seem interested in talking. It was maybe an hour later when things started to feel off. I noticed he was fidgeting, his fingers drumming on his knees, his eyes darting around the cab like he was looking for something. I asked if he was all right, and he just nodded, but there was something in his expression that put me on edge. Then he started asking questions. Weird questions. Not the usual stuff you might expect from a hitchhiker making small talk. He asked if I drove this route often, if I always picked up strangers, if anyone knew I was out here tonight. His voice had this strange, almost curious tone to it, like he was trying to piece something together in his head. I answered him, trying to keep it casual, but my grip on the wheel tightened. The way he was looking at me now, out of the corner of his eye, made me uneasy. There was this tension in the cab, like he was waiting for something, and I could feel my heart rate picking up. It got worse when he started shifting in his seat, like he couldn't get comfortable. He kept glancing at the dashboard, then back at me, like he was sizing me up. I noticed he was clenching and unclenching his fists, his knuckles white in the dim light. I tried to brush it off, telling myself he was just tired or nervous, but that gut feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to try and defuse the situation, so I asked him again where he was headed, hoping to steer the conversation back to something normal. He didn't answer right away, just stared out the window. Then, without looking at me, he said something that made my blood run cold. "Why did you stop?" he asked. "You could have just kept driving." There was something in the way he said it, something almost accusing. I didn't know how to respond, so I just mumbled something about being a good Samaritan, but he didn't seem to be listening. He was staring at me now, his eyes wide and unblinking, like he was expecting something. The tension in the cab was suffocating. I could feel sweat starting to bead on my forehead, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. I just wanted to get him out of my truck, but we were miles from anywhere, and the thought of stopping on that dark, empty highway terrified me. I tried to think of a way to end this, to get him to ask me to pull over and let him out. But he didn't give me the chance. Out of nowhere, he leaned forward, his face inches from mine, and whispered, "Do you know what it's like to be left behind? To be forgotten?" His voice was low, almost a growl, and there was something in his eyes that I can only describe as madness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what he wanted from me, but I knew that I was in danger. I forced myself to stay calm, to think. I kept my eyes on the road, trying not to show how scared I was. "Look, man," I said, my voice shaking, "I think we both need some rest. How about I drop you off at the next truck stop?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring at me, his breathing getting heavier. I was terrified he was going to snap, that he'd do something crazy. I started thinking about what I could use to defend myself if he tried to attack me, but there was nothing within reach. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned back in his seat, his eyes still locked on me. "Yeah," he muttered, almost to himself, "the next stop. That'll work." I nodded, my mouth dry. I could see the lights of a truck stop up ahead, and I prayed I'd make it there without incident. The silence between us was unbearable, the air thick with tension. Every second felt like an hour as I watched the exit sign get closer. When we finally pulled into the truck stop, I almost didn't believe it. I could see other trucks, other people, and it felt like a lifeline. I pulled into a parking spot and turned off the engine, my hands trembling. He didn't move right away, just sat there staring at the dashboard. "Here we are," I said, trying to sound casual. "You can get some rest, maybe grab something to eat." He turned to look at me, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to leave. But then he nodded slowly and opened the door. He grabbed his backpack and stepped out, pausing for a moment to look back at me. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice back to that flat, emotionless tone. I forced a smile and nodded. "Take care," I managed to say. He closed the door, and I watched him walk away, disappearing into the darkness of the truck stop. I sat there for a long time, my heart still racing, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't believe how close I had come to. I don't even know what. Eventually, I pulled myself together and drove off, putting as much distance between me and that place as I could. Even now, I can't stop thinking about that night, about the way he looked at me, the things he said. I don't know what his intentions were, but I'm glad I'll never have to find out. I was driving through the middle of nowhere when I realized I'd gone too far to turn back. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and all I could see were the outlines of trees and the black ribbon of road stretching on in front of me. My gas tank was getting low, and I knew I had to find somewhere to stay for the night. That's when I saw the sign. Vacancy, it read, with a flickering neon light. The motel looked like it had seen better days, the kind of place you'd drive past without a second thought if you had any other options. But I didn't, so I pulled in. The parking lot was empty, except for a couple of cars that looked like they hadn't moved in a while. The office was dimly lit, the sign on the door saying open in faded letters. I grabbed my bag and walked inside. The man at the front desk looked up as I entered. He was older, with thinning hair and a greasy smile that made my skin crawl. He didn't say anything right away, just stared at me like he was sizing me up. "Need a room?" he finally asked, his voice rough and gravelly. "Yes," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just for the night." He nodded and reached for a key hanging on the wall behind him. As he handed it to me, he leaned in a little too close. "We got a special room for folks like you," he said, his breath hot and sour against my face. "Nice and quiet." I forced a smile and took the key, trying to ignore the unease settling in my stomach. "Thanks," I muttered, turning to leave. "Room 13, he called after me, as I pushed open the door to leave. End of the hall. The room was just as run down as the rest of the place. The bedspread was threadbare, the carpet stained, and the wallpaper was peeling at the edges. But it was a place to sleep, and I was too tired to care. I locked the door and set my bag down on the chair by the window. The room was stuffy, so I went to open the window, but it was stuck. The latch was rusted shut. I gave up and turned on the fan, but all it did was rattle loudly, barely stirring the air. I tried to brush off the weird feeling I had, telling myself I was just tired and overthinking things. I got ready for bed, but when I went to turn off the light, something made me stop. I felt like I was being watched. I glanced around the room, but it was just me. The door was locked, the window shut. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. I walked over to the window and pulled the curtain back a little, peering out into the parking lot. It was empty, just as before. But then I noticed something strange. The car I'd parked next had its trunk open. I was sure it had been closed when I arrived. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it before. I turned away from the window and tried to shake off the feeling of unease. But when I looked back toward the bed, I froze. There was a faint glint of light coming from the corner of the room, near the ceiling. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. A tiny red dot. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. The dot was coming from a small hole in the wall, about the size of a pinhead. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Someone had drilled a hole through the wall to watch me. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. I backed away from the wall, my mind racing. Was the man at the front desk watching me right now? How many other rooms had holes like this? I knew I had to get out of there, but I didn't want to tip him off that I knew. I moved slowly, trying to act normal, as if I hadn't noticed anything. I grabbed my bag, threw on my jacket, and slipped out of the room as quietly as I could. The hallway was dark and empty. The only sound was the hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead. I made my way back to the office, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see the man through the window, sitting at the desk, staring down at something. I didn't want to go back in there, but I didn't have a choice. I needed my car keys, and I had left them at the front desk when I checked in. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. He looked up as I entered, his eyes narrowing. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice too casual. "No," I lied, forcing a smile. "I just realized I need to leave earlier than I thought. Can I get my keys?" He didn't move at first, just stared at me like he was trying to figure something out. Then, slowly, he reached into a drawer and pulled out my keys, holding them just out of reach. "You sure you want to leave?" he asked, his voice low. It's pretty late. Not many places open at this hour. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. Yeah, I'm sure. Thanks. He handed me the keys, but as I took them, his hand brushed against mine, lingering just a moment too long. I pulled my hand back and turned to leave, but he called after me. Room 13's always open if you change your mind, he said, that greasy smile back on his face. I didn't respond, just walked out as quickly as I could without running. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop to catch my breath. I made my way to my car, my hand shaking as I unlocked the door. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back at the motel. The man was standing in the doorway, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I found a diner that was open 24 hours and parked in the lot, my hands still trembling. I sat there for a long time, just trying to calm down, telling myself I was safe now. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching me, waiting for me to come back. I know I'll never stay in a place like that again. I live alone in a crowded apartment building in the city. My place is nothing special, just a small unit on the 3rd floor with thin walls and loud neighbors. I always thought the noise was just part of the deal with city living, but recently, things started to get weird. It began with small things. I'd hear odd noises coming from the apartment next door in the middle of the night. At first, it was just the sound of things moving around, clattering, thuds, that kind of thing. I figured it was nothing to worry about, just the usual disturbances in a building like this. But then, the noises got worse. There were loud bangs, like furniture being shoved around, and sometimes even shouting. It was always late, around 2 or 3 in the morning. I'd lie in bed, trying to ignore it, but it would go on for hours. I tried to brush it off, but it got to the point where I couldn't sleep through it. I knocked on their door once, but there was no answer. I thought about calling the landlord or the police, but I didn't want to get involved in something that might be none of my business. Then one night, the noises stopped completely. There was no shouting, no banging, nothing. I assumed maybe they had finally moved out or the problem had resolved itself. I didn't think much of it until a few days later when I noticed that the apartment next door was completely silent. I hadn't seen my neighbor in days. The door was always closed, and I never heard any sounds from inside. The silence was unsettling. I started to worry, especially since I knew they were usually home a lot. One evening, I decided to check it out. I knocked on the door and called out, but there was no response. I knew it was a risk, but curiosity got the better of me. I waited until I was sure no one was around, then I tried the door. To my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was a mess. Furniture was overturned, and there were clothes strewn all over the floor. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. The smell of stale air hit me as I walked in. I looked around, trying to make sense of the chaos. There was a pile of papers on the kitchen counter, and I saw some photographs scattered on the floor. As I bent down to pick them up, I realized they were pictures of different people. Most of them looked like they were taken in public places, parks, streets, shopping centers. What made my blood run cold was that some of the photos showed people I recognized from around the building. I saw one of the apartment manager, another of a young woman from the 3rd floor. They weren't just candid shots, they looked like they had been taken without the subjects knowing. My hands were shaking as I turned over a few more pictures. I saw one that seemed to be of someone tied up, but it was so blurry and out of focus that I couldn't tell what was happening. The sight made me sick to my stomach, I quickly moved away from the pictures and headed to the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open with my foot. Inside, I saw a large trunk in the corner of the room. It was covered in dust, like it hadn't been opened in years. I felt a cold sweat break out as I approached it. I hesitated, but something told me I had to look inside. I slowly lifted the lid, trying to keep my breathing steady. Inside were more photographs, stacks of them, and what looked like a journal. I picked up the journal and flipped through it. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and drawings, all centered around a disturbing theme. There were lists of names, dates, and what looked like plans for something awful. The notes described watching people, following them, and even taking them. I knew I had to leave. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind raced with the implications of what I had found. I quickly shut the trunk and backed away, making sure everything looked exactly as I had found it. As I was about to leave, I heard a sound behind me. My blood froze. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But there was no one there. I made my way out of the apartment, shutting the door behind me as quietly as I could. I didn't stop to look back. I went straight to my own apartment, locked the door, and made sure all the windows were secure. The next day, I contacted the police. I told them everything I had seen and found. They took my statement and went to the apartment, but when they arrived, it was locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. They said they would look into it, but I couldn't help but feel like they didn't take me seriously. After that night, I noticed more police activity around the building. The apartment next door remained empty, and eventually, I saw the landlord putting up a for rent sign. I still think about what I found in that apartment. I'm glad I didn't get caught up in whatever was going on. I hope the police found something useful, but I never heard anything more about it. The whole thing still gives me nightmares, and I keep my door locked extra tight now. Living in a place like this, I've learned that sometimes it's better not to know too much. I never thought a simple detour would turn into a nightmare, but that's exactly what happened. I was driving back home from a long day at work, and my GPS took me on a route I hadn't traveled before. It was getting late, and I was just looking for a place to turn around when I saw an old factory building. The area seemed deserted, and there was a small path leading up to it. I thought it might be a shortcut or a safe place to turn around, so I pulled in. The factory looked abandoned. Windows were broken, and the door was slightly ajar. I figured I'd just drive through and turn around, but when I got out of the car to check, I noticed the door was wide open. I stepped inside, thinking I might find a better place to turn around or even a way out if I had to. The inside was dark and dusty. There was old machinery everywhere, and the air smelled like rust and mildew. I was careful not to touch anything. I took a few steps in and tried to figure out how to get back out. I heard a noise behind me, footsteps. I turned around but didn't see anyone. I shrugged it off and kept walking, but the footsteps got closer. I began to feel uneasy. I walked faster, hoping to get back to my car. That's when I saw them, two men coming through the entrance. They looked rough and worn out. I tried to hide behind some old crates, my heart racing. One of the men said, "She's here somewhere." I saw her come in. I could barely make out the words, but it was clear they were looking for me. I could hear them moving around, shouting for me to come out. I realized they must have thought I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. I ducked behind a large piece of machinery, hoping they wouldn't find me. They kept shouting, and their voices echoed through the factory. I started to panic, thinking about how to get out of there. The factory was a maze of old equipment and dimly lit hallways, which could work to my advantage. I waited until their voices got farther away before I moved. I decided to head towards the back of the building, hoping to find another exit. As I moved through the factory, I tried to stay quiet, stepping carefully over debris. I came across a set of stairs leading down. I hesitated, but with the men getting closer again, I took the chance and went down. The basement was even darker and colder. I could barely see anything, and I had to feel my way around. I heard them coming again, their footsteps echoing through the basement. I found an old door, slightly ajar. It led to a small office area with a desk and some papers scattered around. I looked around quickly, trying to figure out what to do next. I heard one of the men say, "She must be down there. Check everywhere." I knew I had to move fast. I spotted a small window high up on the wall. It was covered with grime and cobwebs, but it was my only hope. I looked around for something to stand on. I found an old box and used it to reach the window. The window was stuck, but I managed to force it open. I climbed through, scraping my arms and legs in the process. I landed outside in a narrow alleyway. I glanced around, making sure the men hadn't followed me. I started running, my breath coming in short gasps. I kept to the shadows, trying to stay hidden. I heard their voices behind me, growing fainter as I put more distance between us. I reached the main road and flagged down a passing car. The driver stopped, and I told them I needed help. The police arrived soon after. I told them everything, and they went back to the factory to investigate. I was shaken, but relieved to be safe. They didn't find the men when they searched the factory, but I had given them enough details for a thorough investigation. The factory was sealed off for a while, and I didn't hear much about it after that. I stayed away from that part of town, avoiding any place that might remind me of what happened. The experience left me with a deep sense of unease, but I was grateful to have escaped unharmed. Looking back, I often wonder what those men were really up to and what they might have done if they had caught me. It all started on a Tuesday evening. I was in my dorm room, studying for a big exam. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number. The message was short: "You should study harder. Your grades aren't good enough." I thought it was just a prank, maybe from one of my friends. I ignored it and went back to studying. The next day, I got another message from the same number. This time, it was more specific: "Saw you at the library. You look tired." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I had been at the library for hours, and I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence or someone who happened to see me. I was at the gym that evening when my phone buzzed again. The message said, "Nice workout. Don't push yourself too hard." I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't just that the messages were creepy, it was that they seemed to know exactly where I was. I decided to block the number and hoped that would be the end of it. But the messages didn't stop. They kept coming, each one more intrusive than the last. "I see you're meeting your friend for coffee. Don't forget to ask about the calculus test," the next one read. I didn't even mention meeting my friend to anyone. I started to wonder if I was being watched. I told my roommate about it, and she suggested it might be a prank from someone in our building. I hoped she was right, but the messages started to include details about my daily routine, things only someone close to me would know. "You left your window open again. It's cold out there," one message said. That weekend, I decided to take a break and go home for a couple of days. I thought it would be a good way to clear my head and escape the stress. But even at home, the messages followed me. Nice to see you're spending time with your family. Don't forget to lock your door tonight. I was terrified. I started to feel like I was being watched all the time. I reported the messages to campus security. They took it seriously but said they needed more evidence before they could take action. They suggested I keep a record of all the messages and any suspicious activity. I started to notice more strange things happening. My car was parked outside my dorm, but one morning, I found a note on the windshield that said, "Hope you're having a good day. I'm always watching." I was afraid to go anywhere alone. I began to constantly check around me and double-check my locks. One evening, I was studying in the library again. I noticed a guy sitting a few rows over, who kept glancing at me. My heart raced every time he looked my way. I decided to leave and texted campus security, asking them to come by and check the area. When I left the library, I saw the same guy standing outside, pretending to be on his phone. I ducked into a nearby store and called campus security again. They arrived quickly and checked the area, but the guy was gone by the time they got there. They said they'd increase patrols around the campus. The messages continued, each one more personal and disturbing. "I saw you at the gym today. You're looking good," one message said. "Don't forget your appointment tomorrow." It was becoming unbearable. I couldn't focus on anything but the constant fear. I started carrying pepper spray and always had my phone ready to call for help. I kept my dorm door locked and even thought about changing my phone number. But each time I tried to relax, a new message would come, and the fear would start all over again. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I got a message that said, "I know you're alone right now. Let's play a game." I felt a cold sweat break out. I didn't know what to do. I called campus security again and told them everything. They came over and searched my room, but they didn't find anything unusual. I stayed up all night, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I received a message that said, "I'm leaving you alone for now. But remember, I'm always close by." I felt a bit of relief, but also more anxious than ever. I didn't know if the person was truly leaving me alone or just waiting for the right moment. Campus security continued to investigate, and they increased their patrols around the dorms. I was advised to keep documenting everything and to stay vigilant. I changed my phone number and told a few trusted friends about what was going on. Months went by with no new messages. The campus security never found out who was behind them, but they were able to increase surveillance and improve security on campus. I eventually returned to some sense of normalcy, but I remained cautious. Looking back, I still feel the anxiety of those days. I never found out who was sending those messages or why they targeted me. I learned to be more aware of my surroundings and to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. The experience left a mark on me, but I'm grateful I made it through safely. I was driving home from work one evening, tired after a long day. I took what I thought was a shortcut to avoid traffic. The sun had just set, and it was getting dark fast. I ended up on a road I didn't recognize, surrounded by rundown houses and boarded-up windows. The area looked abandoned, like it hadn't seen any maintenance in years. As I drove, I noticed a group of men standing by a street corner. They looked out of place, wearing worn-out clothes and loitering in a way that made me uneasy. I tried to ignore them and keep driving, but something made me nervous. I wasn't sure if it was the dim light or the uneasy feeling in my gut. I turned a corner and saw a beat-up car parked in the middle of the road. I couldn't go around it because the road was narrow and there was a dumpster on the side. I had no choice but to stop and wait for someone to move the car. That's when I saw the men from the street corner walking toward me. They surrounded my car, and one of them knocked on my window. I rolled it down slightly and asked if there was a problem. The man had a rough look and a stern expression. He asked me where I was going. I told him I was just trying to get home and was lost. He stared at me for a moment, then said, "You know, you look like an undercover cop." I was taken aback. "What?" I said. "I'm just lost. I don't know what you're talking about." The man didn't seem convinced. He motioned for the others to come closer. They started asking me questions about my job, why I was in the neighborhood, and where I was headed. Their tone was aggressive, and I could tell they weren't going to let me go without an explanation. I tried to explain that I was just a regular guy who had made a wrong turn, but they kept insisting I was lying. One of them said, "We don't like cops around here. If you're one of them, you're not going anywhere until we find out the truth." I felt a wave of panic. These men were not playing around. They were angry and seemed ready to take things further if I didn't convince them quickly. I thought about driving away, but they had positioned themselves around my car in a way that made it impossible to escape. The leader kept glaring at me, and the others started muttering among themselves. The leader asked me for my ID. I handed it over, trying to remain calm. They scrutinized it carefully, comparing it to their own list of known people, I guess. The whole time, I could see the distrust in their eyes. They kept whispering and looking at each other, as if deciding what to do next. After what felt like an eternity, they returned my ID. "Seems legit," the leader said, though his tone still held suspicion. "But we need to be sure you're not lying. We've had trouble with people pretending to be something they're not." They made me step out of the car, and I had to sit on the curb while they continued to question me. I was terrified. I kept thinking about how I could escape if things went south. I was watching every movement they made, trying to figure out if any of them would become violent. The men started discussing among themselves, and their conversation grew more heated. They debated whether to let me go or keep me there longer. I could see the indecision in their faces. Finally, after what felt like hours, they decided to let me go, but not without a warning. "You better stay out of this neighborhood from now on," the leader said. "We're watching. Don't come back unless you want trouble." I quickly got back into my car and drove off. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking on the wheel. I was so relieved to get out of there. I didn't stop until I was back on a main road, far from that rundown neighborhood. When I finally got home, I couldn't stop shaking. I had never felt so scared in my life. I knew I had to be more careful with the routes I took, especially when driving through unfamiliar areas. I reported the incident to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without more information. The experience left me on edge for weeks. I had just moved into this old farmhouse a few months ago. It was a nice place, far from the city, surrounded by fields and woods. I enjoyed the quiet, the peace, and the space to myself. But things took a turn one night, and it became a nightmare I couldn't have imagined. It started with a phone call at 2 a.m. I was already in bed, trying to sleep, when the ringing woke me up. I answered groggily, and all I heard was breathing. Heavy, raspy breathing. I thought it was a prank and hung up, but the phone rang again. I answered, hoping to get some clarity, but the line went dead. The calls continued over the next few nights. At first, they were just strange, with no one on the other end. Then the caller started speaking. He didn't say much, just enough to make my skin crawl. He would say things like, "I see you and I know what you're doing." One night, he said, "I know what you're watching on TV." I hadn't mentioned what I was watching to anyone. It was unsettling. I started feeling like someone was watching me, even when I was alone. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The calls got more detailed. He knew about my work schedule, my favorite shows, and even the names of my friends. The more he knew, the more scared I became. I tried to block the number, but he just called from different ones. Each call felt like a violation, like he was breaking into my life. I decided to go to the police. I told them everything, but they said there was not much they could do without more information. I was advised to keep a record of the calls and try to trace them. I felt helpless, knowing that someone was out there, watching me, and I had no idea who or why. One night, the caller's tone changed. He was more aggressive, demanding to know why I was avoiding him. He said, "You think you can hide from me? I know every move you make." I felt trapped in my own home. The fear was constant, and it began affecting my daily life. I couldn't focus at work, and every little sound made me jump. The final straw was when he called and said, "I'm outside your window." I looked out but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I checked all the locks and made sure everything was secure, but the paranoia was eating at me. I decided to stay up and wait for the next call. I was determined to get some answers. When the phone rang, I answered quickly. This time, he was shouting, his voice full of rage. He said, "You can't run forever. I know everything about you, and you'll never be safe." I felt a surge of panic. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I grabbed my phone, keys, and a flashlight and went outside to my car. I was going to drive to the nearest town and find a place to stay for the night. I knew I couldn't stay here, not with him so close. As I was getting into my car, I saw a shadow move in the distance. My heart nearly stopped. I got in and locked the doors, started the engine, and drove as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a small motel in town. I rented a room and told the manager about the situation. They were understanding and let me stay in a room with a good view of the parking lot. That night, I slept with the lights on, the phone beside me. The calls stopped after that night. I never found out who the caller was or why he targeted me. The police did investigate, but they never found any leads. I moved out of the farmhouse soon after and decided it was best to start fresh somewhere new. The experience left me shaken, and I never stayed in a remote area alone again. I still get anxious when the phone rings late at night. It's a constant reminder of how vulnerable we can be, even in the places we think are safest. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. I picked a remote spot in the national park, far from any other campers. The idea was to get away from everything and enjoy the solitude. When I finally arrived and set up my campsite, everything seemed perfect. It was quiet, peaceful, and just what I needed. That night, I slept soundly, or so I thought. I woke up in the early morning to a strange noise. It sounded like rustling outside my tent. I figured it was just some animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I tried to go back to sleep, but the noise kept me on edge. When I finally got up and poked my head out of the tent, I saw my campsite was a mess. My food was scattered, my backpack was opened and rifled through, and my gear was strewn all over the place. My heart raced. I couldn't believe someone had come through and taken my stuff. I was completely alone in a remote area. The realization hit hard. I started to gather what I could salvage and put it back together. My first thought was to pack up and leave, but then I noticed something even more disturbing. There were footprints leading away from my campsite, and they didn't look like any animal tracks I'd seen. They were human. I followed the footprints for a short distance, but they quickly faded. I felt a growing sense of dread. Someone had been here, and they were still nearby. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call for help. The only option was to stay alert and figure out what to do next. I decided to go back to the campsite and assess the situation. As I walked back, I noticed more signs of disturbance. Some of my gear was missing, and the ground was disturbed in places where it shouldn't have been. I had been so focused on packing up that I hadn't noticed these details before. I tried to stay calm, but the fear was creeping in. I knew someone was out there, watching me, waiting for the right moment. I decided to stay hidden for a while and see if I could catch a glimpse of whoever was stalking me. I found a spot behind some bushes where I could see the campsite but remain concealed. Time passed slowly, and every small sound made me jump. I could hear the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds, but nothing that suggested immediate danger. Still, the paranoia was overwhelming. I felt like my senses were on high alert. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps. I froze and peered through the bushes. A man, disheveled and carrying a backpack, was moving cautiously around the perimeter of my campsite. He was clearly searching for something. I couldn't make out his face, but his presence was enough to make my heart pound. He moved closer to my hiding spot, and I had to fight the urge to make a sound. I waited until he was a few feet away before deciding to make a move. I quietly got up and moved to another hiding spot, hoping he hadn't noticed me. I had to find a way out of this situation without alerting him. My mind raced as I thought about my options. I could try to sneak out and find a ranger station, but that would mean leaving behind my gear and potentially confronting him. I decided my best bet was to stay hidden and wait for an opportunity. Hours went by, and the man seemed to settle down. He started a small fire and sat by it, keeping an eye on the surroundings. It was clear he was not planning to leave anytime soon. I used this time to carefully plan my next move. I had a small knife with me and a flashlight. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As night fell, I knew I had to make my move. The darkness would provide cover, but it also meant I had to be extra cautious. I waited for the man to become less alert, then I started to slowly make my way toward the edge of the woods. I managed to get a short distance away when I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I continued to move, staying as quiet as possible. I could hear the man's voice in the distance, but he seemed to be preoccupied with something. Eventually, I reached a road where I saw a passing car in the distance. I waved my arms and used my flashlight to signal for help. The car stopped, and the driver, a park ranger, offered to take me to safety. I was relieved beyond words. The ranger took me to the nearest ranger station, where I explained everything that happened. They sent a team back to the campsite to investigate, but they didn't find the man. It was clear that I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation. I left the park and went back home, shaken but safe. The experience left me with a heightened sense of awareness and a deep appreciation for the value of being cautious. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly a peaceful retreat can turn into a life-threatening ordeal. I started my hike early that morning on one of the most popular trails in the area. It was supposed to be a peaceful day, with beautiful views and fresh air. I was excited because I'd been looking forward to this hike for weeks. I had my backpack, my camera, and plenty of water. Everything seemed perfect. The trail was crowded at first, but as the morning went on, the number of people thinned out. I found myself alone in a more remote section of the trail. I enjoyed the solitude, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had noticed a man who seemed out of place. He wasn't dressed for hiking, and he kept looking in my direction. I tried to ignore him and focused on the scenery. The man kept his distance at first, but every time I looked back, he was there, just a bit further behind. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Around lunchtime, I met another hiker on the trail. We chatted for a bit. He was friendly and told me he was also hiking alone. We talked about the trail and the weather before we parted ways. I felt a bit more reassured after our conversation. As the day wore on, I noticed the same man still following me. He seemed to be getting closer. I tried to stay calm and made a point of keeping my distance from him. I had seen other hikers earlier, so I hoped if anything went wrong, someone would be around. I took a break by a small stream to rest and eat something. While I was there, I noticed the man had stopped as well, but he was sitting on a rock, watching me. It made my skin crawl. I finished quickly and decided to get moving again. As I continued on the trail, I saw a park ranger who was checking on hikers. I mentioned the man following me, but the ranger said he hadn't seen anyone matching that description. I felt a bit better knowing someone was aware of the situation, but I couldn't shake the worry. A little later, I encountered a group of backpackers who mentioned that one of their friends had gone missing. They were concerned but were trying to stay calm. They said the missing person was a man who had been hiking alone. I tried not to panic, but the missing man matched the description of the one I had seen earlier. I decided to pick up my pace and head back toward the trailhead. The sun was beginning to set, and I wanted to get back before it was dark. The thought of being alone in the woods at night with a potential threat was terrifying. As I hurried along the trail, I saw the man again. He was closer now, and it was clear he was following me deliberately. My heart raced, and I tried to think clearly. I needed to get back to safety, and quickly. I took a few detours along the trail, hoping to throw him off. I kept my pace steady but was constantly looking over my shoulder. Every time I glanced back, he was still there, following at a distance but closing in. I reached a part of the trail where it was easier to hide. I ducked behind some trees and waited, trying to catch my breath and figure out my next move. I could hear the man's footsteps approaching. I held my breath and hoped he wouldn't see me. The man walked past where I was hiding, and I waited until I was sure he was out of sight before moving again. I knew I had to get back to the trailhead as soon as possible. I decided to take a more direct route, even if it meant risking being seen. As I neared the end of the trail, I saw the park ranger again. I ran up to him and explained everything. He took my information and said he would alert the authorities. I was relieved but still shaken. The ranger escorted me to my car and made sure I was safe before heading back to the trail to search for the missing person. I drove home with my heart still racing, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, I learned that the missing man had been found. He had been lost but was safe. I was relieved but still unnerved by the whole experience. I couldn't help but wonder if the man who had been following me was involved somehow. I decided to take a break from hiking for a while. The experience had left me shaken, and I needed time to recover. I was thankful that I had made it out safely and that someone had been there to help me. The memory of that day still lingers in my mind. Every time I think about it, I remember the fear and the feeling of being watched. It was a stark reminder of how quickly a routine hike can turn into something terrifying. I was driving home late one night, after a long day at work. The road I usually took was closed for maintenance, so I decided to take a shortcut through a rural road I wasn't too familiar with. It was dark and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the fog. Everything seemed fine until I saw a car wreck up ahead. The car was overturned and looked like it had been there for a while. There were no other cars around, and the area was eerily quiet. I slowed down and pulled over to check if anyone needed help. I wasn't sure if it was a good idea, but something made me stop. As I approached the wreck, I noticed something strange. The car wasn't just overturned, it looked staged, like it was intentionally placed there. The scene was too perfect, almost like a set for a movie. My gut told me something was off, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the area and saw no signs of other vehicles or people. It was just the wreck and me. I started to feel uneasy and decided to get back to my car. Just as I turned around, I heard a faint rustling in the bushes nearby. My heart pounded in my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was probably an animal, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I got back into my car and locked the doors, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I had a terrible feeling that I wasn't alone. Before I could start the engine, I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. A dark figure emerged from the woods, heading straight toward my car. My first instinct was to drive away, but I was too scared to move. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The figure came closer and I could see that it was a man, dressed in dark clothes. He seemed to be carrying something in his hands, but I couldn't make out what it was. My fear intensified as I realized he was walking deliberately toward my car. I had to act quickly. I started the engine and began to back out, hoping to get away before he reached me. But just as I was about to turn around, another vehicle appeared from a side road and blocked my path. I was trapped. The man approached the vehicle that had appeared, and I could see more figures now, emerging from the shadows. It was clear that this was not an accident. The wreck was a trap, and I had walked right into it. I knew I had to find another way out. I looked around desperately and saw a narrow path through the trees, just wide enough for my car. It was risky, but it seemed like my only chance. I took a deep breath and drove toward the path, hoping it would lead me to safety. The path was rough and uneven, and I had to navigate carefully to avoid getting stuck. Behind me, I could see the figures moving, but they were far enough back that I had a chance to escape. The car behind me tried to follow, but the terrain was too difficult for it to keep up. As I drove deeper into the woods, the path became more twisted and dark. I had no idea where I was going, but I kept pushing forward. I was terrified and exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, the path opened up to a small clearing with an old cabin. It looked abandoned, but I saw it as a potential refuge. I parked the car and quickly got out, hoping to find shelter or at least a phone to call for help. I approached the cabin cautiously, but it was locked and there was no sign of anyone inside. I kept my distance, staying close to my car in case I needed to leave quickly. I waited and listened for any sign of the men who had been chasing me. Hours passed, and the night seemed endless. I stayed hidden, trying to stay awake and alert. I could hear distant noises, but nothing close enough to be a direct threat. Eventually, the noises faded and I began to feel a bit safer. When morning came, I cautiously made my way back to the main road. I was relieved to find that no one seemed to be following me anymore. I drove straight to the nearest police station and reported the incident. The police took my statement and promised to investigate the area. I went back home feeling shaken but thankful to be safe. The experience left me with a deep sense of unease, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I avoided that route for a long time and made sure to always stick to well-traveled roads from then on. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I often wonder what might have happened if I had stayed at the scene or been less cautious. It was a harsh reminder of how dangerous seemingly simple decisions can become in the wrong circumstances. I grew up in a small town where rumors and legends were as common as the trees. One of the most persistent stories was about an old abandoned house on the outskirts. It had been vacant for years, but there were whispers about strange things happening there. Of course, I had to see for myself. One afternoon, I decided to check it out. The house was far from the main road, tucked away behind overgrown bushes and trees. The sight of it was both intriguing and unsettling. The paint was peeling, and the windows were boarded up, but it was still standing. I parked my car a distance away and approached on foot. As I got closer, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. I had a flashlight and my phone, ready to document anything I found. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dim and dusty, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. I shone my flashlight around and saw old furniture covered in sheets. It was the kind of place that seemed frozen in time. I took a few more steps in, noting the eerie silence that filled the space. As I explored the ground floor, I noticed something odd. There were recent footprints on the dusty floor. They were not just in and out tracks, but seemed to lead from one room to another. I followed them, my curiosity growing despite the growing sense of unease. The footprints led me to a room at the back of the house. The door was partially open, and I could see a faint light coming from inside. I pushed the door open further and saw something that made my heart race, a makeshift bed and some personal items scattered around. It was clear someone had been living there recently. I looked around and noticed a few more unsettling details: a half-eaten meal on a table, a stack of newspapers, and a pair of boots by the bed. Whoever had been here was not only living in the house, but had been there very recently. I started to feel like I was intruding on someone's private space. As I was about to turn and leave, I heard a noise from the floor above. It was a thump, followed by a scraping sound. I froze, my flashlight beam flickering around the room. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. My instinct screamed at me to get out of there. I turned off my flashlight and quietly made my way back to the front door. As I walked, I heard more noises from upstairs, this time definitely sounding like footsteps. Someone was moving around up there. Just as I reached the front door, I heard a loud crash from above. It was so sudden and close that I jumped. I knew I had to leave quickly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I could feel eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anyone. I opened the front door slowly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. As I stepped outside, I glanced back at the house and saw a shadow moving in one of the upper windows. My heart pounded as I realized someone else was in the house, and they knew I was there. I ran to my car as fast as I could, my flashlight swinging wildly with my hurried movements. I glanced back once more and saw the shadow in the window was now gone. I started the car and sped away from the house, not daring to look back. When I got home, I called the police and told them what had happened. I wasn't sure if they would take me seriously, but I gave them all the details I could. They said they would send someone to check the house, but I wasn't sure if they'd find anything. That night, I couldn't shake the fear from my mind. Every little sound made me jump, and I found myself checking the locks on all my doors more often than usual. The thought of someone using that house as a hideout and possibly being so close to me made my skin crawl. The next day, I learned from the police that they had found evidence of recent activity in the house, but the person or people using it had vanished. The house was sealed off, and they planned to keep an eye on it. I was relieved that they took it seriously, but disturbed that they hadn't found anyone. I never went back to that house. The memory of the shadow in the window and the noises I heard still haunt me. I sometimes wonder who was hiding there and what might have happened if I had stayed just a little longer. The house remained abandoned, and the rumors only grew, but I knew firsthand that there was something very real and very unsettling about that place. I agreed to house sit for a friend who was going out of town for a week. It seemed like a simple favor at first. Watch the house, feed the cat, and make sure everything was locked up at night. The house was in a quiet suburb in Oregon, the kind of place where nothing much ever happens. I figured it would be an easy gig, just some time to myself in a nice house. The first night was uneventful. I settled in, made myself some dinner, and watched TV. The house was pretty big, bigger than my apartment, and it felt a little too empty. The silence was noticeable, but I didn't think much of it. I locked the doors and windows before heading to bed, trying to get comfortable in an unfamiliar bed. Sometime around midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me, but then I heard a faint noise, like something shuffling or scratching. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. My heart started racing, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just a cat. I lay there for a few minutes, listening. The noise continued, a soft thumping sound now, like someone moving things around down there. I told myself it was probably just the old house settling or the wind outside. But the noise didn't stop. Finally, I decided to check it out. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and headed downstairs. The house was pitch black, except for the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The stairs creaked under my weight, and each step seemed louder than the last. When I reached the basement door, I hesitated. The noise had stopped, and everything was quiet again. I almost turned back, but something in me needed to see what was down there. I slowly opened the door and shined the flashlight down the stairs. The basement was cold and musty, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete. I stepped down into the basement, my eyes scanning the room. There were old boxes, some tools, and a washing machine in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to turn around and head back upstairs when I noticed something strange. There was a section of the wall that looked different, like the paint was newer, fresher than the rest. I walked over to it, and that's when I saw it, a small door, almost hidden behind a shelf. The door was wooden, with no handle, just a latch. It didn't look like it had been used in years. My stomach turned, but I felt like I had to open it, like I needed to know what was inside. I unlatched the door and slowly pulled it open. The smell hit me first, a foul, rotting odor that made me gag. I shined the flashlight inside and froze. The room beyond was small, barely more than a closet, but it was filled with the most disturbing things I'd ever seen. There were old, dirty mattresses stacked against one wall, with dark stains all over them. Chains hung from the ceiling, and the floor was littered with broken glass and pieces of old clothing. In the corner, I saw a pile of photographs. They were of different people, all looking terrified, their eyes wide with fear. Some of the photos were torn, others were crumpled, but they all had the same expression, like they were staring into the face of something horrible. My hands were shaking, and I wanted to get out of there, but my legs felt like they were stuck to the floor. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. Then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they were coming down the basement stairs. I turned off the flashlight and backed into the corner, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps grew louder, and then I saw a shadow at the top of the stairs. Someone was there, standing in the doorway, just out of sight. I held my breath, praying that whoever it was wouldn't notice me. But then the footsteps started again, coming down the stairs, one slow step at a time. I could hear them breathing now, heavy and labored, like they were excited. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped in that horrible little room, with nowhere to run. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but all I could do was stare at the door, waiting for it to open. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. There was a long silence, and then I heard the door creak open. A figure stood in the doorway, barely visible in the darkness. I could see the outline of a man, tall and broad, his face hidden in the shadows. He didn't move at first, just stood there, staring into the room. I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. My whole body was trembling, and I thought I was going to pass out. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back up the stairs. I waited until I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, then slowly crept out of the room. My legs were weak, and I felt like I was going to collapse at any moment. I didn't stop to grab anything, just ran out of the basement, through the house, and out the front door. I didn't care about the rain pouring down or the fact that I was barefoot. I just ran, as fast as I could, until I reached the neighbor's house. I pounded on their door, desperate for someone to help me. When they finally answered, I couldn't even explain what had happened. I just kept saying I needed to leave, that something was wrong in that house. The police came later, but they didn't find anyone in the house. The basement door was closed, and when they opened it, the room was empty. No photos, no chains, nothing. It was like I had imagined the whole thing, but I knew what I saw, what I felt. I never went back to that house, and I haven't spoken to my friends since. I don't know what was going on in that basement, but I'm sure of one thing: I was never supposed to find that door, and I was lucky to get out of there alive. I decided to rent a cabin in Alaska for a weekend. Needed a break from everything, you know? Work had been a lot, life had been a lot, so I figured a few days out in the wilderness would help clear my head. The place I found was perfect. Remote, surrounded by trees, and the snow made it all look so peaceful. It was just what I needed. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it inside, just reading and enjoying the quiet. The only sound was the wind outside and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It was nice. By the time night came, I felt more relaxed than I had in a long time. The silence out there was different, almost heavy, but it was a nice change from the city noise. When I woke up the next morning, I went outside to take a look around. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that wakes you up instantly. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, too. They started near the edge of the trees and came right up to the cabin door. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but they were definitely human footprints. But I hadn't heard anyone, and there weren't any cars or roads nearby. I hadn't even seen another person since I arrived. I looked around, trying to see if anyone was out there, but there was nothing. Just the wind and the snow-covered trees. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was probably just a hiker passing by. Maybe they were curious about the cabin. I didn't think too much of it. Not then, at least. That night, though, things started to feel different. I had been lying in bed, drifting off, when I heard it. A tapping sound. Light, but distinct. It was coming from the window near the front door. I froze, listening. It wasn't a tree branch or the wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I got up, my heart pounding, and went to the window. The tapping stopped the moment I got close. I peered outside, but there was no one there. Just the dark shapes of the trees swaying in the wind and the thick blanket of snow on the ground. I stood there for a while, just staring out, waiting to see something, anything. But nothing happened. No more tapping. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep well. Every little sound kept waking me up. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. The next day, I checked outside first thing. The footprints from yesterday were still there, but no new ones. Everything was undisturbed. It almost made me feel like I'd imagined the tapping, like it was all in my head. I spent the day trying to enjoy myself, but I couldn't relax. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. By the time night fell, I was on edge. I tried reading again, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing over at the windows, waiting for that sound. And then it started again. The tapping. This time, it was on the window near the kitchen. Soft, persistent. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, but like before, it stopped as soon as I got close. I shined the light outside, sweeping it across the trees, but there was no one there. The snow was untouched, and the night was dead quiet. It was like whoever or whatever was out there was toying with me. I locked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. But that didn't help much. The tapping came back. It moved around the cabin, from window to window. First, near the living room, then by the bedroom. Always stopping just before I could catch it. I felt trapped, surrounded by something I couldn't see. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear that damn tapping. It felt like it was getting closer, more insistent. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that there was a logical explanation for it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. On the third day, I decided I'd had enough. I was packing up to leave when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints. The ones from 2 days ago. They hadn't melted or been covered by new snow. They were still there, as fresh as the day I first saw them. It didn't make sense. The snow should have covered them by now, or at least softened the edges, but they looked untouched, like they'd just been made. That night, the tapping was different. It was louder, more forceful, almost like a knock. And this time, it wasn't just outside. I heard it from inside the cabin, too. At first, it was faint, coming from the far side of the room. Then it got closer. It felt like it was right behind me, tapping on the walls, the floor, the windows. I grabbed the flashlight again, moving from room to room, but I couldn't find anything. The tapping followed me, like it was always just one step ahead, just out of reach. It was driving me crazy. I felt like I was being hunted, played with. Then, as I was standing in the middle of the living room, trying to figure out what to do, the tapping stopped. The silence was sudden, jarring. I stood there, waiting, but all I could hear was my own breathing. I thought, maybe, it was over. Maybe whoever or whatever had finally left. But then I heard it. A slow creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. It came from the bedroom. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I hadn't left the bedroom door open, but I could see it now, slightly ajar, just enough to make out the darkness inside. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The creaking continued, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. Then it stopped, and there was silence again. That was almost worse than not knowing where they were or what they were doing. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that cabin, from whatever was inside it. As I drove away, I looked back once. The cabin was dark, the windows reflecting the moonlight off the snow. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, just a shadow against the light, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, hours later. It started with a knock on my door one rainy afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I live alone in a small apartment in Seattle. The kind of place where everyone keeps to themselves. When I opened the door, there was no one there, just a package on the floor, unmarked and plain, like someone just left it there in a hurry. I picked it up and brought it inside. It wasn't heavy, but it didn't feel empty either. Just a small, nondescript box with no return address, no label, nothing. It was strange, but I didn't think too much of it at first. I figured maybe it was a mistake, or someone sent it anonymously. I sat down at my kitchen table and opened it carefully. Inside, there were photographs, just a stack of pictures, nothing else. No note, no explanation. Just the photos. I flipped through them, and at first, they seemed ordinary. Pictures of the street outside my building, the coffee shop I go to, the park I walk through sometimes. But then I realized something that made my heart drop. The photos were of me. All of them. In every single picture, I was there. Walking to the coffee shop, standing at the crosswalk, leaving my building. They weren't taken from up close, but I could tell it was me. The way I dress, my hair, the bag I carry. I felt a chill run through me, and I kept flipping through the photos, my hands shaking now. They were all from the past week, I could tell because I recognized the outfits and the places. Someone had been following me, watching me, taking pictures without me knowing. I reached the last photo in the stack, and I nearly dropped it when I saw what it was. It was a picture of me, in my apartment, asleep in my bed. The angle was from the corner of the room, near the door. It was dark, but I could see myself clearly, curled up under the covers, completely unaware. I stared at that photo for what felt like forever, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. How did someone get into my apartment? How did I not hear them? The thought that someone had been inside while I was asleep made my skin crawl. I jumped up from the table and checked my front door. It was locked, the deadbolt in place. I checked the windows, too, but they were all shut and locked as well. There was no sign of a break-in, nothing out of place. It didn't make any sense. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hand shaking so bad I could barely hold it. They sent an officer over, and I showed him the pictures. He looked concerned, but there wasn't much he could do. He took the photos as evidence and said they'd investigate, but he didn't seem hopeful. He told me to keep my doors locked and be careful. After he left, I sat on the couch, staring at the spot where the box had been. I couldn't stop thinking about that last picture, the one of me sleeping. I felt sick to my stomach, knowing someone had been that close to me without me even knowing. The next few nights were the worst. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept checking the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. But I never felt safe. I kept imagining someone standing over me while I slept, watching, waiting. I started noticing things, too. Little things that seemed off. A shadow moving outside my window, a creak in the hallway, the feeling of being watched when I walked to my car. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but it didn't help. One night, I woke up to a sound in my apartment. It was soft, just a faint creak, like someone stepping on the floor. My heart was pounding, and I lay there, frozen, too scared to move. I listened, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was nothing, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked the apartment again, every inch of it, but there was nothing out of place. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I came home from work and found another package at my door. This one was smaller, but it filled me with dread the moment I saw it. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what was inside, but I had to know. I brought it inside, sat at the table, and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single photo, just one. It was a picture of my bed, taken from the same angle as before, but this time it was empty. Just the bed, neatly made, like it was waiting for someone to get in. I stared at it, my mind racing. There was no date, no time, nothing to tell me when it was taken. It could have been from that morning, or from weeks ago. But it felt like a message, like whoever was doing this was telling me they could come back any time. That they were watching, waiting. I called the police again, and they sent someone over, but it was the same as before. They took the photo, asked me some questions, but there was nothing they could do. No fingerprints, no clues, nothing to lead them to whoever was doing this. I started staying with a friend after that. I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore, couldn't stand the thought of being there alone. I didn't feel safe, didn't feel like I could ever feel safe again. The police never found out who it was, and the packages stopped after that. But I still think about it all the time, still wonder who it was and what they wanted. I moved to a new place, a different part of the city, but I still check the doors and windows every night, still feel like someone could be watching. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. The rain was coming down hard that night, hammering against the windows like 1,000 tiny fists. It was late, probably close to midnight, and I was alone in the house. My husband was out of town for work, and the kids were staying over at their grandparents' for the weekend. The house was too quiet, except for the rain and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I was in the living room, half watching some old movie on TV, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept hearing these noises, faint and distant, like something moving around. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe the house settling, but the more I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't either of those things. It was coming from the basement. Our basement was unfinished and mostly used for storage. I didn't go down there much, only when I had to fetch something or put away some boxes. The thought of going down there now, in the middle of the night, made my skin crawl. But the noise kept going, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone or something was moving around. I tried to ignore it at first, turning up the volume on the TV and telling myself it was nothing. But the noise got louder, more persistent, until I couldn't pretend anymore. My heart started to pound as I stood up, trying to muster the courage to check it out. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the basement door. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, each step feeling like it took a year off my life. The air down there was cold and damp, the kind that clings to your skin and makes you shiver. I could hear the noise more clearly now, and it was definitely coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. When I reached the bottom, I swung the flashlight around, its beam cutting through the darkness. The familiar sight of dusty boxes and old furniture greeted me, but nothing seemed out of place. The noise had stopped, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. But then, I heard it again, closer this time. It was coming from behind a stack of old boxes in the corner. I hesitated, my heart racing, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the boxes aside, revealing a wall I had never paid much attention to before. That's when I saw it, a door. It was small, almost like a crawlspace entrance, and it was set low on the wall, half hidden by the boxes that had been piled in front of it. I could swear it hadn't been there before. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle. The metal was cold and slick from the damp air. I hesitated, thinking maybe I should just turn around and go back upstairs, pretend I hadn't seen anything. But something drew me to it, an urge I couldn't explain, like I had to know what was behind that door. I pulled it open, and the hinges let out a long, low creak that sent chills down my spine. The smell hit me first, musty, like old earth and rotting wood. I shined the flashlight into the darkness beyond, and that's when I heard it. Voices. They were faint, almost like a whisper, but they were definitely there. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unsettling, like a low murmur of conversation that wasn't meant to be heard. I froze, the beam of the flashlight trembling as I tried to focus on the source of the sound. The space beyond the door was narrow, like a tunnel, with rough walls that looked like they had been carved out of the earth. The voices seemed to be coming from somewhere further down, where the tunnel disappeared into darkness. I felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct telling me to slam the door shut and run back upstairs. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I don't know what possessed me to take that first step into the tunnel, but once I did, I couldn't stop. The walls closed in around me, the air growing colder and thicker with each step. The voices grew louder, more distinct, though still too low for me to understand. I kept going, the flashlight flickering as I walked deeper into the tunnel. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a point where the tunnel widened into a small, circular room. The walls were lined with shelves, old and rotting, and on those shelves were jars, dozens of them, filled with murky liquid and something floating inside that I couldn't make out. The sight of those jars made my stomach turn, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. That's when I noticed the source of the voices. In the center of the room was a large, old-fashioned radio, the kind you'd see in black and white movies. It was crackling with static, and from that static came the voices. They were clearer now, but still muffled, like they were speaking from a great distance. I inched closer, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The words were still indistinguishable, but the tone was cold, almost clinical, like someone giving instructions. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I kept moving closer, drawn to that voice like a moth to a flame. Then, without warning, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into total darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to turn back on, but it was dead. The voices continued, growing louder, more urgent, and I realized they weren't coming from the radio anymore. They were all around me. I turned and ran, my hands outstretched to feel the walls of the tunnel as I stumbled back the way I had come. The voices followed me, growing louder, more frantic, like they were right behind me. My heart was in my throat, and every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there as fast as I could. I reached the door, almost tripping in my haste, and slammed it shut behind me. The voices stopped instantly, leaving me in a silence so deep it was deafening. I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door as if I could somehow keep whatever was on the other side from getting out. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally gathered the courage to move. I backed away from the door, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stand. The basement was quiet again, just the sound of rain hitting the windows above. The door looked normal, just an old, dusty piece of wood, but I knew better now. I stumbled back up the stairs, barely able to catch my breath, and locked the basement door behind me. I don't know what I found down there, and I don't want to know. The house felt different after that night, like it was watching me, waiting for something. I never went back down to the basement, and I made sure the door stayed locked at all times. I was driving through Arizona late at night, and the rain was coming down hard, making it difficult to see the road. I'd been on the road for hours, and my eyes were burning from the strain. I just wanted to find a place to rest, somewhere cheap where I could crash for the night. That's when I saw the sign for the motel. It wasn't much to look at, a flickering neon sign and a few rundown rooms lined up in a row, but it was better than nothing. I pulled in, the tires splashing water as I parked. The place looked deserted, not a single car in the lot besides mine. The office was dimly lit, and when I went inside, an old man was sitting behind the desk, watching an ancient TV set with terrible reception. He barely looked at me when I asked for a room, just handed me a key and mumbled something about checkout being at 10 a.m. I took the key, walked back out into the rain, and found my room. Number 7, right in the middle of the row. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the room inside wasn't any more inviting than the outside. The bedspread was old and worn, the carpet stained, and the whole place smelled like mildew. But I was too tired to care. I dropped my bag on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed. It was then, as I was lying there, staring at the water-stained ceiling, that I heard it. A faint noise, coming from the room next door. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the rain hitting the side of the building, but then I heard it again. A low, muffled sound, like someone was talking, or maybe arguing. The walls were thin, and I could just make out the tone, but not the words. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was none of my business, but the more I listened, the more I could hear. It wasn't just one person. There were multiple voices, all talking at once, too low for me to understand what they were saying. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The noise went on for a few minutes, then stopped abruptly. The sudden silence made the room feel even more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got up, went to the window, and peeked out through the curtains. The rain was still coming down hard, but through the sheets of water, I could see shadows moving outside. They were just shapes, barely visible in the darkness, but there was definitely more than one person out there. They were moving past my door, slowly, like they were trying to be quiet. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them. What were they doing out there in the rain, in the middle of the night? I backed away from the window, my pulse quickening. Something was off about this whole situation. The voices, the shadows, it was like they were waiting for something, or someone. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, which wasn't surprising in a place like this. I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. Then, I heard it again, the voices, only this time they were louder, closer. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make out what they were saying. It was still too muffled, but I could tell they were agitated, maybe even angry. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any second. A soft knock on the door made me jump. I stood frozen, my hand hovering over the doorknob. It was just a single knock, not like someone who wanted to get my attention, more like a signal. I backed away from the door, not daring to make a sound. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I didn't know what to do. Should I open the door? Should I stay quiet? My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was going on, but I couldn't think straight. All I knew was that I didn't want to open that door. The shadows outside, the voices next door, everything about this place was wrong. I decided to stay put, hoping whoever was out there would go away if I didn't answer. But the knocking continued, slow and steady, like they knew I was inside and weren't going to leave until I opened the door. I backed up until I was against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, the voices next door started up again, louder and more urgent. It sounded like they were arguing, and I could hear things being knocked over, like there was a struggle. I was terrified. What if they came through the wall? What if the people outside decided to break down the door? Suddenly, everything went quiet. The knocking stopped, the voices stopped. All I could hear was the rain and my own ragged breathing. I didn't move, didn't even dare to breathe, waiting for something to happen. A few minutes passed, and still nothing. I crept back to the window, just enough to peek out. The shadows were gone. The lot was empty, just my car sitting there in the rain. I let out a shaky breath, but the fear didn't go away. If anything, the silence made it worse. I went back to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the lock. I was ready to bolt out of there, to get back in my car and drive as far away from this place as I could. But something stopped me. I don't know if it was fear or instinct, but I hesitated. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sound on the other side. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Someone was right outside the door, just standing there, breathing heavily. My blood turned to ice. They hadn't left. They were waiting for me to open the door. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to get out, to run. But I was trapped. If I opened the door, they would get in. If I stayed, I didn't know what they would do next. Then, the doorknob rattled. Slowly at first, then more forcefully, like someone was trying to open it. I watched in horror as it turned slightly, but the lock held. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag, threw on my shoes, and bolted for the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I sat on the floor, my back against the door, holding my breath, waiting. The doorknob outside stopped turning, and everything went quiet again. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just sat there in the darkness, praying they would go away. Minutes passed, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. I was too scared to move, too scared to think. Finally, I heard footsteps, faint and fading, like someone walking away. I waited, still too scared to come out. Eventually, the fear of staying in that room outweighed the fear of what might be outside. I got up, crept to the door, and opened it just enough to peek out. The room was empty. I could see the front door from where I stood. It was still closed, the lock still in place. I made a run for it. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was in my car with the doors locked. The rain was still coming down hard, but I didn't care. I started the engine and sped out of that lot. I checked into the hotel late, just past midnight. My flight had been delayed, and I was exhausted. The airport was only a few minutes away, and this hotel was the closest option. The lobby was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when the night has settled in and everyone else is already asleep. The receptionist barely looked at me as she handed me the key card. She muttered something about breakfast hours, but I wasn't paying attention. I just wanted to get to my room, take a shower, and crash for the night. When I got to the room, I swiped the key card and pushed the door open. The lights were dim, and the room had that standard, impersonal hotel feel. Bed, desk, TV on the wall. The air conditioner hummed quietly, and the smell of stale air lingered. I noticed a suitcase almost immediately. It was sitting in the corner, near the window, half hidden by the curtain. My first thought was that the hotel had given me a room that was still occupied. I hesitated, wondering if I should go back to the front desk and ask for another room. But then I looked around more carefully. The bed was made, towels were neatly folded on the bathroom counter. There was no sign of anyone else having been in there recently. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the suitcase and crouched down. It was an old, beat-up thing, black with scuffed edges. The zipper was half undone, like someone had been in a hurry when they closed it. My hand hovered over it for a moment before I finally pulled the zipper all the way open. Inside, there were stacks of cash. Neat, orderly piles of bills, all bound with rubber bands. I froze, staring at it. There had to be tens of thousands of dollars in there. My mind raced. What the hell was this doing in my room? And then I saw the note. It was just a small, folded piece of paper tucked between the bills. My hands were shaking as I opened it. It was a simple message, delivered to 1029 Cypress Avenue. Do not contact anyone. You have until 2 a.m. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was 12:45 a.m. The address was only a few miles away, but that didn't give me much time. My heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to take the money and run, but the rest of me knew that whoever left this here wouldn't let me get away that easily. I sat down on the bed, staring at the suitcase. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the distant sound of a plane taking off. My thoughts were jumbled, a mix of fear and confusion. Why me? Why this room? Before I could make a decision, there was a knock on the door. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't move. Maybe if I stayed quiet, whoever it was would go away. But the knock came again, louder this time. My stomach twisted in knots. I stood up, moving towards the door as quietly as I could. I peered through the peephole. There was a man standing on the other side. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket, his face hidden in the shadow cast by the hallway light. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel the tension in the way he stood, like he was ready to force his way in. I backed away from the door. The knocking became more insistent, a pounding that echoed through the room. Whoever this was, they weren't going to leave. My mind raced. I could call the front desk, but what would I say? That there was a man at my door, and I found a suitcase full of money in my room? They wouldn't believe me. And even if they did, that man outside wouldn't just disappear because I asked for help. I looked around the room, trying to think of another way out. The window. I rushed over and pulled the curtain aside. I was on the second floor, but there was an emergency staircase just a few feet away. I could make it if I was fast. The pounding on the door grew louder, more desperate. I grabbed the suitcase without thinking, slung it over my shoulder, and unlocked the window. The night air hit me like a shock, cold and sharp. I crawled out onto the metal platform, my heart racing. As I climbed down the steps, I heard the door to my room burst open. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept going, my feet hitting the ground harder with each step. The suitcase was heavy, weighing me down, but I didn't dare leave it behind. I hit the pavement and ran. The hotel parking lot was empty, just rows of darkened cars. My own car was parked on the far side, and I made a beeline for it. I could hear footsteps behind me, fast and determined. They were catching up. I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them in my panic. I could feel the man getting closer, his footsteps echoing off the pavement. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to unlock the door. I threw the suitcase into the passenger seat and jumped in, slamming the door shut just as the man reached for me. I didn't look at him as I sped out of the lot, tires screeching on the asphalt. I could see him in the rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, watching me as I drove away. I didn't stop until I was miles from the hotel, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I pulled over in a deserted parking lot, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The suitcase was still sitting on the seat next to me, the note crumpled on top of it. I didn't know what to do. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I jumped. It was a text from an unknown number. You have 1 hour left. Don't be late. I sat there for a long moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I knew I had no choice. I couldn't run, couldn't hide. Whoever these people were, they wouldn't let me get away. I started the car again and headed for Cypress Avenue, the suitcase sitting heavy in the seat next to me. The streets were dark and empty, the city asleep around me. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. Every car that passed made my heart race. When I finally reached 1029 Cypress Avenue, it was a rundown warehouse on the edge of town. The kind of place where no one would hear you scream. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the building. My phone buzzed again. Leave the suitcase at the door. Walk away. I did as I was told. The suitcase felt even heavier as I carried it to the door. I set it down, took one last look at the building, and turned to leave. As I walked back to my car, I heard the door creak open behind me. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. The car door felt like a lifeline as I climbed in and drove away. Jake and I had planned our camping trip for months. We were both excited to escape the city and spend a weekend in the quiet of the woods. We found a spot deep in the forest, far from any roads or other campers. It was perfect. We set up our tent, made a fire, and settled in for the night. The first night was peaceful. We sat by the fire, talking and laughing until late. The stars were so bright, and the air was so fresh. It felt like a dream. We went to sleep, looking forward to a day of hiking and exploring the next day. The following morning, we packed some snacks and water, and set off on a trail we had found nearby. The forest was beautiful, and we lost track of time as we walked. It was late afternoon when we decided to head back. On our way, we stumbled upon an old, overgrown path that we hadn't noticed before. Curious, we followed it. After a while, we reached a clearing. In the middle, there was a small cabin. It looked abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it. The windows were boarded up, and there were strange markings on the door. We decided not to get any closer and turned back towards our camp. As we walked away, I had a feeling we were being watched. I glanced back a few times but saw nothing. When we finally got back to our camp, the sun was setting. We made dinner and tried to forget about the cabin. That night, we heard noises outside our tent. At first, it sounded like animals, but then we heard voices. We froze, listening. There were people outside, talking in hushed tones. Jake grabbed a flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. He peeked out and then quickly pulled back inside. "Lisa, there are people out there, with guns," he whispered. My heart started pounding. We stayed as quiet as we could, hoping they would leave. After a few tense minutes, the voices faded away. We stayed awake, too scared to sleep. In the morning, we found footprints around our campsite. Whoever they were, they had been very close. We decided to pack up and leave. As we were packing, 3 men appeared from the trees, armed with rifles. They looked rough, with unkempt beards and dirty clothes. "This is our land," one of them said. "You're trespassing." "We're sorry, we didn't know," Jake replied, trying to stay calm. "We'll leave right now." The man shook his head. "It's too late for that. You've seen too much." Panic set in. We had no idea what they meant, but it was clear we were in serious trouble. They forced us to walk ahead of them, deeper into the woods. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. What were they going to do with us? After what felt like hours, we reached another clearing. There were more people there, all armed. They had a small camp set up, with tents and a fire pit. They forced us to sit by the fire while they talked among themselves. Jake and I exchanged worried looks. We had no idea what to do. One of the men, who seemed to be the leader, walked over to us. He had a cruel look in his eyes. "You two are going to stay here for a while," he said. "We need to figure out what to do with you." My mind was racing. We needed to find a way out. That night, they tied us up and left us in one of the tents. We could hear them talking and laughing outside. I knew we had to escape, but I didn't know how. In the middle of the night, I managed to loosen the ropes around my wrists. I woke Jake and freed him too. We quietly slipped out of the tent, trying not to make any noise. We crept through the camp, avoiding the guards. Just as we thought we were in the clear, one of the men spotted us. He shouted, and the others came running. We bolted into the forest, running as fast as we could. They were right behind us, shouting and firing their guns. We ran for what felt like hours, not daring to stop. Eventually, we reached a river. We jumped in and let the current carry us downstream. The cold water was a shock, but it was our only chance. We drifted for a while, until we were sure we had lost them. We climbed out of the river, exhausted and shivering. We had no idea where we were, but we kept moving, putting as much distance between us and the survivalists as possible. By dawn, we found a road. A passing car stopped, and the driver called the police. When the police arrived, we told them everything. They searched the forest but found no trace of the camp or the men. It was as if they had vanished.